2024 was supposed to be the year of recovery, but for who? Putin's relentless push to swell the ranks has made the Russian army one of the largest in the world, with 1.3 million active soldiers and another 2 million in reserve. But this show of force came at a steep cost on the Russian home front, one that Russia is about to pay in blood. Meanwhile, Zelensky kept Ukraine's plans for the latter half of 2024 shrouded in secrecy, offering only cryptic hints of a strategy in motion. NATO, after months of waiting, finally began delivering F-16 fighter jets in July, following Congress's approval of a $60 billion aid package in April. The first half of the year was spent preparing for war, the second half unleashing it. And yet, despite Russia's overwhelming numbers and resources, Putin is teetering on the brink of a catastrophic defeat. Russia reinvigorated its efforts to invade and occupy Ukraine in May 2024. On paper, Russia had plenty of avenues to win the war. It had the manpower advantage as a result of relentless conscription campaigns and the fact that Ukraine had a little less than half of Russia's population to begin with. It had the material advantage, being perhaps the only country that produced the ammunition that the Soviet-era tanks and artillery batteries used, and which were the main military equipment on both sides of the war. The US Congress had previously spent months bickering about sending more aid to Ukraine, believing that funding the war would be a pointless effort. Yet throughout all that, the so-called summer invasion was a resounding failure for Russia, perhaps due to the bizarre choices made by the Russian military command. You see, apart from the initial blitzkrieg attempt at reaching Kyiv from the north, which was repelled within a few months of the invasion starting, Russia has focused most of its efforts on occupying the eastern and southern points of Ukraine. The former was a relatively obvious target, with Russia already annexing Crimea 10 years ago and having a much greater geopolitical presence in the surrounding Ukrainian regions to begin with. The latter was done to prevent Ukraine from being able to export goods, as Ukraine is a significant grain exporter across the Black Sea. Therefore, most of 2023 was spent with Russia putting more pressure on the eastern side of the Russo-Ukrainian front, occupying the Donetsk region. The Russian army's next goal in the area for 2024 was naturally going to be the largest city in the region, that being Pokrovsk. The 60,000 population city is the transportation hub between the eastern front and the rest of Ukraine, so Russia was trying to capture the city as part of the 2024 summer campaign made sense in a way. However, what happened was nothing short of a moment of impulsiveness. Instead of going for the eastern front, the main Russian force during the May and June campaigns was focused on the northern city of Kharkiv. That's the same city and the same region that was under siege in the first few months of the invasion all the way back in 2022, and which the Ukrainians retook by September of that year. Additionally, rather than pressing into the Kharkiv region with armored vehicles and tanks supported by long-range artillery strikes, Russia heavily favored infantry-based tactics. From the reports in the area, Russia used cobbled-together turtle tanks, which were unwieldy armored vehicles, with the goal of absorbing as much Ukrainian fire as possible and giving more breathing room to the infantry forces. For infantry, Russians turned to equipping troops with motorcycles to give them more maneuverability and speed compared to traditional armored vehicles. Apparently, the goal of the summer campaign was to cover as much ground as possible, as fast as possible, using as little of Russia's heavy armor as necessary. This could stem from the widespread shortage of tanks that Russia could allocate to the campaign in the first place. In 2023, it became apparent that Russia was running out of modern armor. Russia's most modern battle tank was the T-90, effectively an upgraded version of the old T-72 that was manufactured throughout the Soviet era. However, Ukraine has been able to deal with the T-90s via the gifted tanks from the West and by exploiting the tank's critical weak spot under the chassis, the autoloader. Unlike the Western tanks, the T-90, as well as the T-72, uses an auto-loading mechanism, but also stores excess sensitive ammunition, which is located under the turret. If an explosion, such as the one delivered by mine or drone, the latter of which Ukraine has become bona fide experts in, hits the turret, there's a chance that all the stored ammunition detonates and obliterates the tank. By removing Russia's more modern tanks from the equation, both Russia and Ukraine have mainly relied on the contingent of older Soviet-era tanks like the T-72s, T-62s, and even older T-55s. The Western sanctions on Russia have prevented it from getting more modern pieces of equipment, which resulted in Russia being forced to salvage or re-equip Soviet tanks to use in the war. Even with that, a bulk of the tanks were being sent to the Eastern Front. That led to the strange situation where Russia has mainly used infantry tactics to make headway into the Kharkiv region. For the first few weeks of the summer offensive, Russia did see some progress, managing to eke some 10 miles into Ukrainian territory, but nowhere near close to the city of Kharkiv itself. The losses that Russia accumulated over the summer offensive were staggering. According to Ukrainian intelligence, the invading force contained between 30,000 and 70,000 soldiers, leading to a significant increase in daily losses incurred by Russia. Ukrainska Pravda, a news outlet that tracks daily losses, suggests that Russia has been losing over 1,200 soldiers per day across all fronts throughout the summer offensive. Over the course of May and June, the months with the most activity on the newly opened Kharkiv front, Russia suffered around 70,000 casualties. That's a significant blow to the already failing Russian morale and attempts to improve the troop count, with many comparing the Russian tactics to feeding soldiers into a meat grinder for no apparent reason. So what was the ultimate goal behind the summer offensive? Some strategists suggest that Russia was confident that the lower estimate of 30,000 troops would be enough to dig deep into Ukrainian territory and capture Kharkiv. After all, Ukraine itself has focused its efforts on fortifying the eastern front, so it wasn't out of the realms of possibility to consider that Kharkiv would be sparsely defended as a result. Other tacticians believe that the Kharkiv offensive was meant as a diversion. Its goal was to make Ukraine think that Russia was putting most of its efforts into occupying Kharkiv, forcing the Ukrainian army to change gears and fall back from the eastern front to defend the north. Either way, Russia was planning to use Kharkiv as a means to an end, with that end being making more progress on the eastern front. However, all the Russians ended up doing was falling into a massive trap. The Kharkiv invasion, ill-equipped and poorly planned as it was, turned out to be a massive failure. Despite early gains, Russia couldn't maintain the momentum, and Ukraine managed to reinforce the area with minimal setbacks on the eastern front. The Russian army was forced to retreat relatively quickly, allowing Ukraine to retake the occupied villages near the border and proclaim victory in that battle. Granted, Russia managed to gain some territory in the east, roughly 400 square miles, but it came at the cost of 70,000 soldiers, significant losses in tanks and other armored vehicles, and the main target of Pokrovsk was still relatively safe. And remember, by the time Russia started the summer invasion, Ukraine still had yet to receive the financial and military aid that the US Congress announced in April. When the summer offensive was over, that money and equipment started to trickle into the country. Now it was up to Ukraine to make the move. And so we come to the beginning of August 2024, when Ukraine made one of the most surprising yet effective advances in the past 18 months of warfare, the invasion of Kursk. On paper, the Kursk region should have the same amount of defenses on the Russian side as Kharkiv did on the Ukrainian side. Both regions are on the border between the two countries and therefore have a high potential of being used as part of the northern front in the war. However, Ukraine went in with a much smaller contingent, some reports suggesting around 1,000 troops only, and completely swept through Russia's defenses in the area. More troops followed soon, creating an organized yet mobile invading force that could occupy one village after another without setting down permanent defenses. Ultimately, Ukraine's success came down to a few factors. One, Ukraine has managed to provide a much more effective cover and pressure via artillery fire in Kursk. The strikes focused on key military fortifications and infrastructure that could be used to reinforce the area with more troops. Satellite images of the region showed a few bridges and vital roads being destroyed throughout the region, effectively cutting the Russian army off from the mainland. Second, Russia has vastly overestimated the effectiveness of its ground forces in the area. As a result, most of the troops stationed throughout the Kursk region ended up being fresh recruits who have only had several weeks of combat training and were not exactly meant to fight on the front lines. What ended up happening with the new troops was a wave of Russians surrendering as the Ukrainian army advanced from one village to the next. Within the first week of the invasion, a Ukrainian prison that was housing prisoners of war reported processing 300 captured Russian soldiers, more than 80% of whom were newer conscripts. According to some estimates, the actual count of the prisoners could inflate by several hundred in mere weeks. Russia has also heavily underplayed the importance and the extent of the Kursk region. The initial reports made by the Russian Ministry of Defense suggested that the invading army had only 300 soldiers. The subsequent report even went so far as to proclaim that the Ukrainian troops were being actively pushed back by the local troops. This was a bold-faced lie to cover up the utter failure of the Russian war machine to account for the mere possibility that Ukraine was suddenly gaining ground. Soon after, more accurate reports by the Ukrainian and Western intelligence came in with surveys of the actual damage dealt in the Kursk region. They suggested that the invasion has caused between 120,000 and 200,000 residents of the area to become displaced, with Ukraine managed to occupy dozens of villages and slowly advance toward the administrative center of Kursk. 3 weeks after the incursion, the Russian response is still uncertain. For the most part, Russia continues to downplay the effect of the Kursk incursion on the actual progress of the war. The country's artillery has managed to slow down the Ukrainian forces and has thus far prevented them from going deeper into enemy territory. On the other hand, Russia has also scrambled to create trenches roughly 25 miles into the occupied territory. These trenches don't seem like they're going to be used as defensive positions by the Russians though. Based on Russian actions so far and the state of the military in the region, it's likely that Ukraine can take control of these trenches and use them as stopgaps in a prolonged counter-invasion of Russia. On the other hand, Russia has reinvigorated its efforts on the Eastern Front. Reports from the last 2 weeks of August 2024 suggested that Russian forces have come as close as 7 miles to the city of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainian government has urged the residents of the city to evacuate, but has encountered significant issues with moving large numbers of civilians so close to the renewed front lines. The reason for that is Russia's complete lack of care for Ukrainian civilians. Even before the newest waves of fighting, the Russian army has displayed utter ruthlessness when it comes to dealing with civilians. Throughout the war, Russia has frequently targeted primarily civilian areas with missiles and drones, forcing the Ukrainian military to heavily invest and ask for anti-air defensive systems, such as the US-made Patriots. The Russian airstrikes were focusing on Ukrainian hospitals, which housed both civilian and military casualties, an act which is against the Geneva Convention and international humanitarian law. In contrast, the Ukrainian army has made efforts to minimize civilian casualties in Kursk, working alongside international humanitarian organizations to provide aid to the people who remained in the area. The reinforcements and infrastructure that were struck by the Ukrainian airstrikes primarily had a military use, preventing Russia from reinforcing the region. Furthermore, Ukraine has shown no long-term goals to control the area it occupied during the Kursk incursion, at least according to the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry. This is unlike Russia's persistent efforts to annex parts of Ukraine, trying to claim the Donetsk region. President Zelensky has suggested that he's ready to present a plan to the US that outlines the terms of a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. The invasion of Kursk is therefore meant to drive down the narrative that Ukraine is not yet ready to yield to Russia and will continue to go on the offensive. By doing so, Ukraine can get a significant edge over Russia. First, the extent of the invasion in Kursk showcases how much Ukraine can accomplish in a relatively short time with restricted access to Western resources. While Russia has managed to occupy roughly 400 square miles of Ukrainian land between January and July 2024, Ukraine currently holds some 500 square miles of the Kursk Oblast territory, all acquired within the span of 3 weeks. This gives Zelensky the confidence to ask for more resources, particularly long-range missiles, fighter jets and artillery, which would allow Ukraine to press deeper into Russia by advancing on the newly made Kursk front. This will allow Ukraine to force Russia to back away from the Eastern Front and rethink whether Kursk is an unimportant part of the wider war. Additionally, the recent allotment of aid primarily comes in the form of ammunition and anti-air missiles, which have seen consistently positive results on the Eastern Front throughout the Kursk invasion. One of the most recent Russian attacks on the Eastern Front has been a devastating airstrike with 127 missiles and 109 drones launched, according to an Al Jazeera report. Ukraine's air defenses have managed to take out 102 missiles and 99 drones, heavily reducing the damage Russia could inflict on Ukrainian military compounds, infrastructure, and even civilian areas. Russia has been getting bolder in what it terms acceptable military targets, with one drone hitting a dam only miles upstream from Kyiv. The dam suffered minimal damage and remained intact, but it showcased that Russia will not relent until it completely dominates Ukraine. To that end, the current incursion of Kursk provides a twofold solution to this problem. First, Ukraine has started to ramp up its drone attacks as well, considering that the country has heavily invested in creating a domestic military drone industry and has received long-range missiles from NATO. The current effective range of the Ukrainian drones is estimated to be roughly 1,100 miles away from the Ukrainian border. By pushing further into Russian territory, Ukraine can create a favorable position to start launching more precision strikes directly at Moscow. Until now, Moscow has been relatively untouched by the conflict. The conscription efforts were disproportionately targeting rural areas, especially people who belong to Russia's many national minorities. A PBS News interview in 2023 suggested that 6 out of 10 regions with the highest death tolls were in Siberia and the Far East, and that men from certain minorities were as much as 75 times more likely to die from the war than Muscovites. In contrast, Moscow has seen a significant brain drain in the first months of the war, with around 900,000 Russians leaving the country by the end of 2022. Many of them were blue-collar, highly skilled workers, which has largely stripped the capital of people who view the war negatively. If Ukraine manages to put direct military pressure on Moscow and give the capital a feeling of what it's like to be in an active war, it's highly likely that the public sentiment on the war will change. Even in an authoritarian regime such as Putin's, this could lead to a significant ideological shift within the country that could spell doom for the nation's leadership and geopolitical relations. But let's go back to the second reason why Ukraine's Kursk invasion can solve its air defense problems. The army's ability to withstand hostile airstrikes while advancing in enemy territory gives Zelensky more sway to ask for direct military equipment from NATO countries, primarily in the form of Patriots and other anti-air defense systems. These can prove vital if Ukraine wants to maintain its momentum and pressure Russia without receiving air retaliation. And Ukraine has one more ace up its sleeve for aerial supremacy. The F-16s have arrived. After months of training, NATO's shipment of 65 F-16s has been deemed ready to take flight over Ukraine, piloted by Ukrainian fighter pilots. The F-16 is one of the most modern fighter jets available to both sides of the conflict. Russia has the Su-27s, which were specifically made to counter the threat of the F-16 but failed to do so. The addition of F-16s aims to degrade what little is left of Russia's hope to control Ukraine via its airspace. This is why Zelensky has also been adamant about asking for even more fighter jets to defend the country. The small victory that the Ukrainian army achieved in Kursk can be seen as a precursor and a catalyst of what can be done in the wider context of the war itself. But why is airspace control vital in turning the tide of war? The answer lies in Russia's saber-rattling. During 2022 and 23, NATO efforts to end the war by providing Ukraine with more advanced military equipment have been met with resistance from Russia. Putin has frequently alluded to the possibility that there's a line that NATO cannot cross, or it risks impeding on Russia's sovereignty, which is quite rich considering the goal of the special military operation. Russia has frequently used its reserve of nuclear weapons to prevent NATO from providing full support to Ukraine under the pretense that Ukraine would use the weapons to invade Russia in turn. While that moment has happened, Ukraine has managed to occupy a portion of Russia. The Russian response was to first deny the claims, then fabricate increasingly bold lies about the state of the invasion, followed by a half-hearted attempt at securing the Kursk region while also pressuring Ukraine on the existing eastern front. Therefore, it became even more unlikely that Russia will use nuclear weaponry against Ukraine and NATO. NATO's strategy so far has been to arm Ukraine just enough so it can prolong the war, but avoid crossing Russia's lines in the sand, so to speak. The Kursk incursion and lack of Russia's nuclear responses might just give NATO the go-ahead to approve more ambitious plans to provide more comprehensive aid to Ukraine. This means that Putin is losing all his leverage against the West, and that NATO can start putting more pressure to end the war in Ukraine's favor. But there's yet another factor to consider when discussing the current war events: economies. Both Russia and Ukraine have had to heavily change how their economies function in wartime. Ukraine is using nearly $350 billion worth of financial and military equipment aid from Europe and the US to keep itself running. More specifically, the country had previously suffered greatly from Russia being able to control the Black Sea with its navy, a military force that Ukraine is sorely lacking in. However, Ukraine managed to score yet another significant victory on that front, mainly via drone warfare. Starting with the spring of 2022, Ukraine has made several attempts to create drones that were specifically made for sea-to-sea warfare. The sea-deployed Magura V5 drone was designed to deliver an explosive payload by swimming rather than flying. The first public showcases of the Magura V5s were made later in the year, damaged Russia's newest Black Sea Fleet flagship and a minesweeper. Emboldened by the success, Ukrainians began to use the drones more offensively and supported their sea-based attacks with traditional air-to-surface strikes deeper into Russia's territory to cut off access to the Black Sea. The result was 26 sunk or damaged ships in the Russian fleet, forcing Russia to withdraw from Sevastopol in October 2023. This allowed Ukraine to reopen some of its previous maritime trading routes and start exporting across the Black Sea. By August 2024, Ukrainska Pravda reported that the reopened Black Sea corridor had been used by 2,300 ships over the past year, and that grain exports were slowly starting to reach pre-war numbers. This effectively means the country doesn't solely need to rely on financial aid to get its economy up and running. In contrast, Russia's economy has become more isolationist than ever. In response to the invasion, the EU has stopped Russia's oil and gas exports. In response, Russia has been forced to find new clients, namely China and India. But the deal with China comes with significant caveats. The price of natural gas was purported to be roughly half of what Russia was achieving on the Western market, limiting its options to create income from selling natural resources. The US has also posed significant economic sanctions on Russia, preventing the country from trading in US dollars or obtaining any technology or equipment that could be construed as being used militarily. The short-term effect of the sweeping trade changes was that China and Russia achieved record trade volume in 2023 at over $240 billion. However, even that doesn't seem like it'll work out in Russia's favor in the long run. While the total trade has managed to grow slightly, the oil trade has actually seen a decline in 2024 so far compared to 2023, and the prices are unstable. Furthermore, Russia's economy has evidently gone all in on supplying the war effort. The 2024 budget has allocated around 39% of the government funding to military and national defense, a staggering figure compared to the rest of the world. Russia has now one of the highest military spending figures, both in total and as a percentage of GDP, 6%, compared to the US's 3.4%, China's 1.7%, and NATO's 2.7% average. This can be attributed to the country's blossoming energy sector, which is again a response to Russia's heavy reliance on exporting oil and natural gas. The energy sector has the potential to create an even greater imbalance in employment opportunities for Russian citizens. If the energy sector is more lucrative than, let's say, manufacturing or agriculture, Russia will see a significant shift in energy companies gaining employees at the expense of other industries. The newly minted middle and upper classes will create a demand for the service sector, which will again drain the less desirable industrial sectors. But the process can only continue as long as the energy sector continues to grow, and that growth isn't sustainable. Furthermore, the downfall of the other sectors will force Russia to depend on importing more and more from neighboring countries, typically China or the former Soviet nations like Kazakhstan and Belarus. Ultimately, this gives China far greater control of Russia's geopolitics than Putin might feel comfortable with. If China decides to pull the plug on Russian exports as a result of US pressure, Russia's economy might be facing a downturn, which will halt the country's militaristic ambitions. When the invasion started, and over the course of the following 2 years, Russia was hoping to use its resource advantage to drain Ukraine's resources and win by plowing over what was left of the country when the latter's military was annihilated. However, the recent events in Kursk have shown that Ukrainians have plenty of fight left in them, and that the world no longer has much to fear from Russia's nuclear arsenal. With Russia's military proving to be at an increasing disadvantage compared to Ukrainian troops bolstered by NATO, Russia's economy propped up by China and already past the point of no return, and Putin unable to manipulate NATO into standing down, Russia has pretty much run out of options. We might see that the closing months of 2024 and the beginning of 2025 become the effective end of the Russo-Ukrainian war. If that happens, Putin is unlikely to have much ground to make demands for peace will be enforced on Russia, and it might spell doom for Russia as a country itself. But what do you think? Does the Kursk invasion of Russia mean that Ukraine is on a quick path to victory, or will the war continue for a few more years? If you're an affluent citizen in a mafia state, when would you think it's time to pack your mob boss off to a comfortable exile, preferably in the middle of nowhere? For Russia's oligarchs, the time to act against their Don might be coming soon. But why? When the war in Ukraine began, Western experts hoped that military defeat and pressure from economic sanctions would inspire action against Putin on the part of Russia's affluent elite. Russia might be a dictatorship, but even dictators need to keep their supporters happy. In the initial days after sanctions were put in place, such as on the SWIFT financial system, Russia's currency, the ruble, cratered, and the Russian economy shrank by about 1.2% in 2022. It rebounded in 2023 though, as Russia exploited new energy trading relationships with countries like China, India, and Turkey, which wanted to take advantage of bargain prices for Russian oil and gas. Growth in 2023 was about 3.6%. Russia also experienced 4.7% growth in the first 2 quarters of 2024. The ruble, meanwhile, rebounded from its low of a 142.6-to-1 exchange ratio with the US dollar on March 7, 2022. Although it never sustainably recovered to pre-war levels, it was generally trending toward them through 2024. Russia's economic growth and incremental gains on the battlefield were enough for Putin to be re-elected as the president of Russia earlier this year, with a totally legitimate 88% of the vote, conveniently the highest he had ever received in the 5 times he contested the office. At this point, it's best to remember that Putin's new best friend, Kim Jong-un of North Korea, holds ceremonial elections too. Russia's electoral ceremony came at the time when Ukraine's morale and foreign aid were at a low point and its ammunition shortages were at a high point. But things have changed significantly since then. The West has ramped up its military aid and loosened some of the restrictions on Ukraine's use of long-range weapons, such as the Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles, against targets in Russian territory. There's more. Russian casualties ballooned during the summer as Ukraine's new weapons and ammunition made its meat grinder tactics even costlier. As the Russian military ground its way forward in eastern Ukraine, it suffered enormously. Ukraine inflicted 70,000 casualties between May and July, a rate of about 1,000 per day, and roughly a tenth of the total number of dead and wounded Russia had suffered throughout the entire war. Despite these casualties, Putin did not issue another mobilization order, even though he is in desperate need of more manpower. Why? Because he likely understands that it would be a bridge too far, even for him. Most of the soldiers on the front come from Russia's poorer, minority and outlying populations. However, these areas have already suffered heavy casualties and are under stress since many of the military-age men have already been drafted. An additional mobilization order would need to be broader in its scope. It would likely need to include men from Moscow and St. Petersburg, since they're Russia's largest cities. Russia's elites might be able to overlook the destruction of military-aged populations outside of their country's European heartland, but they are not willing to shoulder the costs of the war themselves. Putin understands this and has taken great care to avoid shifting the costs of the war onto the affluent populations of Moscow and St. Petersburg. That policy has forced him to be creative when it comes to getting manpower. Such methods have included the recruitment of foreign troops from Africa, coercing foreign students studying in Russia to sign up for military service, lest they face deportation or imprisonment, and even human trafficking, where Russian agents trick men from India and other Southern Asian countries into taking fake jobs that then require military service. Russia's elites were fine with all of this, but something changed in August. Something which caused the ruble's value to start collapsing again, something which exposed them to the consequences of the war. On August 6th, Ukraine began its incursion into Russia's Kursk region. Poorly trained conscripts guarding the border areas were completely unprepared and surrendered. Fortifications that were supposed to have impeded the movement of hostile troops proved useless. The uselessness of fortifications supposedly similar to the ones that had successfully stopped Ukraine's offensive into Zaporizhia in 2023 likely came because the work was done improperly. This time around, corrupt Russian officers took the allocated money for themselves instead. The result was sloppy construction. In May 2023, a small force of pro-Ukrainian Russian fighters held territory in the border Belgorod region for several days before withdrawing. This Belgorod raid signaled the weakness of Russia's border defenses and caused significant chaos on the Russian home front. Despite this, Russia appears to have waved it off, believing it could never happen again. Ukraine took advantage of this belief and decided to launch a much bigger raid now. The offensive into Kursk and Belgorod regions has seen Ukraine occupy much more territory in Russia. Seizing territory in Russia has also given Ukraine's weapons longer reach. It may not be able to use Storm Shadows and ATACMS, but moving forward has given Ukraine's shorter-range weapons an ability to reach new targets. It also gives Ukraine territory from which to launch further drone attacks, sometimes at long ranges. Ukraine has now accumulated a lot of experience in launching drone attacks against important targets in Russia. A recent example occurred in June, when a drone attack damaged one of Russia's precious Su-57 fighter jets. Ukraine has also launched attacks on Moscow. Now that Ukraine occupies territory in Russia, those attacks are hitting higher-value targets. Long the victims of Russia's attacks on its civilian energy infrastructure, Ukraine gave Russia a taste of its own medicine on September 1, 2024. Ukrainian drones hit a power plant near Moscow on that night. Ukraine has also captured or targeted oil depots and refineries. These energy sources are not only important for Russian civilian life, they are the backbone of Russia's economy. Oil and gas accounted for 22.4% of Russian exports in 2021 and 30 to 50% of its federal budget over the past decade before the war. The damage to these facilities is a reason why the ruble tumbled following Ukraine's incursion. The attacks also came at a bad time for Russia. It's about to get cold there, and Putin will need to ensure the power stays on to heat homes. A harsh winter in Moscow because of Ukrainian attacks on Russia's energy infrastructure is a sure way to create more discontent at home. Putin may be willing to lose over 1 million men to achieve his objectives in Ukraine, but as we know by now, he is not willing to subject the residents of Moscow and St. Petersburg to the war's harsh effects, whether directly or indirectly. That's why exposing elite Muscovites to the cost of the war is one of Ukraine's goals. President Zelensky has requested clearance to use long-range missiles against military targets near the Russian capital as part of demonstration attacks. To make matters even better for Ukraine, the Russian territory it now holds can be used as a relatively secure base to launch these attacks. This area is relatively secure because Putin cannot easily bomb it. Doing so means attacking his own country's civilian population. He might not care about deliberately attacking civilians in other countries like Ukraine and Syria, but when his own power is threatened, it's not a move he's keen on making. Putin may have something else to worry about too. On July 28th, he attended a naval parade in St. Petersburg. Ukraine allegedly had the knowledge and means to assassinate him that day. And Zelensky mentioned last November that if the chance arose, his country's military had every right to take it. The Ukrainians would, however, need American weapons to do the job. Washington refused this, allegedly on a call from Russia's new defense minister, Andrei Belyusov, to the United States Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. However, Ukraine also let this information leak, demonstrating that they had the ability to act against him. In response to the incursion of Russia, Putin has had to reshuffle troops from the occupied territories in eastern Ukraine. He has also moved air defense systems from areas near the front line toward Moscow and the Kremlin. Tellingly, he's also moved them to Sochi, where he conveniently has a vacation home. Russia might be suffering from its largest invasion since World War II, but at least he feels safe. To make matters worse still for Russia, the incursion into Kursk and Belgorod was done with Western tanks at the forefront. Far from discouraging their use in this way, the Western powers are confirming that they will continue to supply Ukraine with weapons even to conduct the offensive. Not using Western weapons against targets in Russia was one of the last remaining conditions that French President Emmanuel Macron called a taboo earlier this year. This taboo, too, might now be starting to break. The West has invested significant diplomatic, military, and financial resources into Ukraine. Abandoning it now that it moved into Russian territory would not be an easy move to make without losing a lot of face and emboldening other authoritarian powers like China, Iran, and North Korea. Ukraine's offensive into Russia is not only about humiliating Putin, but also a way to get its Western partners to loosen restrictions on the use of long-range weapons. So far, these requests have not been granted, and the idea to use long-range missiles against targets in the Moscow area remains a Ukrainian dream. However, now that Ukraine is conducting operations in Russia, these taboos might find a way of breaking their own accord, a fact it is undoubtedly aware of. The offensive into Russian territory has deteriorated Moscow's standing on the international stage too. Later in August, on the day before Ukraine's Independence Day, President Zelensky hosted Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. This was a very important meeting because in July, Modi decided to visit Moscow instead of Washington during the NATO summit, a move which drew sharp international criticism. Modi was even seen hugging Putin. However, the Ukrainian attack into Russia might have begun to change his calculations. In Ukraine, Modi expressed his desire to play a personal role in negotiating a peace deal. He told Zelensky that in Moscow a month earlier, he had said to Putin that the conflict could not be solved on the battlefield. At the end of the summit, Zelensky thanked Modi for supporting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Modi repeated a similar sentiment shortly thereafter. This was a significant development because in June, India took part in a multilateral peace summit in Switzerland. At that summit, India did not sign on to a joint communique that emphasized the right to territorial integrity of Ukraine and all other states. As August ended, Zelensky hoped to take advantage of the strengthened ties. He proposed a summit in India to take place before the American presidential election on November 5th. Thus far, India has been reluctant to engage Ukraine in a systematic way while excluding Russia, but a spokesman for Modi's government did not rule out the idea of another bilateral summit. Modi has continued to insist that he personally wants to play a constructive role in the peace process. The strengthening of Ukraine's relationship with India would be significantly to Russia's disadvantage. Indian purchases of Russian energy have been crucial in preventing the latter's economy and currency from collapsing. In July 2024, at least, India overtook China as the largest purchaser of Russian energy. This is not a relationship that Russia can afford to see deteriorate. It likely isn't a coincidence that the ruble tumbled as Modi expressed his support for the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Responding too aggressively against the Ukrainian incursion also risks another critical relationship for Russia: the strategic partnership with China. Putin's potential resort to nuclear weapons, which has scared some policymakers in the West from providing Ukraine all the equipment it wants, will be increasingly revealed to be a hollow threat the longer Ukrainian troops occupy territory in Russia. China has insisted that no nuclear weapons should ever be used in the conflict. Ukraine and the West have long been upset with China for its passive attitude in regards to the war, but this is the one consistent policy that it's maintained since the invasion began. Because Russia is dependent on Chinese energy purchases and parts for its military equipment, it cannot afford to alienate Beijing. Ukraine's continual demonstration that it can hold territory in Russia, gain more of it, and strike at Russia's two most precious population centers does more every day to erase the supposed red lines Putin drew. Ukraine knows it can do this because Russia cannot afford to issue nuclear threats too much and risk its relationship with China. The West may have underestimated Putin's ability to hold on to power. He held on early in the war, when Russia's economy appeared to be on the brink of collapse. He continued to hold on in the second half of 22, when Russian forces had been driven from much of the territory it had taken earlier in the year. But in the face of these recent developments and signals of weakness, Russia's elite might be starting to question their loyalty to their dictator. The deceased Yevgeny Prigozhin, the former leader of the Wagner Group, caused quite the stir in June 2023 when he rose in revolt against Putin and the then Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. Wagner took control of the important supply hub of Rostov-on-Don before coming close to Moscow and backing off thanks to a deal brokered by Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko. Prigozhin conveniently died in a plane accident a few months later. The swift end of the mutiny reinforced Putin's power in the short term, but he was strangely absent during the crisis. This absence and the seeming need for Lukashenko to end the revolt might have planted a seed of Putin's weakness in the minds of Russia's ruling elites. Those seeds were dormant when Russia appeared to be succeeding, but things are now different thanks to Ukraine's continued holding of Russian territory. There will be significant military, economic, and geopolitical consequences that come with this new reality. The inability to quickly expel Ukrainian troops from the Kursk and Belgorod oblasts has signaled much greater weakness on Putin's part than was the case a year ago when Ukraine's counteroffensives in Zaporizhia and Donbass were stalling. Now with Ukraine in Russian territory and the ruble in trouble again, there are more signs of trouble at home. The first sign has already materialized. A man named George Zakrevsky made news on August 14th. Zakrevsky is the leader of another Russian private military company called Paladin. Before that, he served in the KGB and the Soviet Army. During that time, he was involved in activities that are still classified. Paladin might not be as famous as the Wagner Group, but the unit has similar experiences. It's seen action in Africa where it protects strategic objectives. As a loyal instrument of Russian foreign policy and a fellow KGB man, Zakrevsky does not appear to be the type to turn on Putin, but he did just that in a call to action last month. Our country is not just on the brink of disaster or already right next to it. Our country is already in trouble. In big trouble. Drones are flying all over central Russia, right up to Moscow and St. Petersburg. They even attacked the Kremlin. Our Black Sea fleet is being pushed out. It's being pushed out as if we are not a great power with a great fleet, but some third-rate country. Our air force is practically not working because it's also being pushed out. We are standing in the same positions that we took more than 2 years ago, and partly in those to which we retreated. The population is dying out, becoming impoverished, drinking itself to death. No one cares. All they have time to do is bring in migrants. And all this was done by the so-called president, the great Putin. After a lengthy denunciation of corrupt and incompetent officers in the Russian army, Zakrevsky concluded, "To those who are in the trenches, you know very well what kind of indecency is happening there right now. You know very well the faces that are mocking you and your relatives. We call on everyone to join our union to save our country." Zakrevsky took a big risk in denouncing Putin, and even more so for issuing a call to action against him. His words were supposedly spread widely to Russia's elites and likely came only because he knew that some of his peers in the military and civilian spheres, at least privately, shared his feelings. Russia is a country with a history of regime changes in the wake of wars not going well. The loss in the Russo-Japanese War nearly toppled Tsar Nicholas II. The Russian front collapsed in World War I and resulted in 2 revolutions that ultimately led to the Bolshevik takeover of the country. Putin faces a dilemma that wielders of tyrannical power have faced throughout history. They used cutthroat methods to acquire and maintain power, often requiring the assistance of cutthroat allies who have an interest in seeing the regime's continuation. However, the man at the head of this regime can only ensure his own survival by catering to these interests. If they feel that their interests are no longer being served, the mobsters will turn on their boss, who will be left hoping that comfortable retirement will be the worst thing that happens to him. The longer Ukraine continues to hold territory in Russia, the more likely it will be that things go wrong for Putin far beyond the front lines. More military reserves mean more casualties and a demand for manpower in Russia, which can only be answered through more conscription, by taking troops off the lines in Ukraine, or both. Ukrainian successes and Russian failures on its own soil also increase the likelihood that Ukraine will be able to use Western weapons against military targets near Moscow and St. Petersburg, as Western leaders increasingly realize Putin's threats are bluffs. Meanwhile, more shows of Russian weakness mean a higher likelihood of states that had once been amenable to Russia, like India and China, begin to reassess their interests. The more all of these things go wrong at once, the weaker Putin becomes internally. At some point, the machinery keeping him in power will decide that it's losing more than it's gaining. It's unlikely that Ukraine will be able to defeat Russia outright on the battlefields of eastern Ukraine, and vice versa, but all wars are political affairs first and foremost. If Putin loses political power, Ukraine wins. It seems that the Ukrainians have calculated that this is their best strategy and have taken action accordingly. If it only took weeks of having boots on the ground in Russia to topple one of the regime's dominoes, Kyiv might have a good reason to be optimistic about broader gains for every inch of ground it takes on Russian soil. What do you think is coming next in Russia as Ukraine continues its operations in Kursk and Belgorod? What military, political, economic, and diplomatic consequences its continual presence there bring? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. As the war in Ukraine drags on, now past the 2.5-year mark, the truth about Russia's staggering losses is becoming impossible to ignore. While the Kremlin stays silent, the mounting graves across Russia tell a chilling story. In 2023 alone, Russia has spent $2.5 million expanding cemeteries, a grotesque sign of the war's true human cost. This isn't just a statistic. It's double what was spent in 2022 and 6 times the amount in 2020. But the real horror is what's still to come. At the current rate of death, experts predict Russia's troop losses will surge to 1 million by 2025. Think about that, 1 million soldiers gone. The last time a single nation saw such devastation was during World War II, a cataclysm that reshaped the world. Now Russia is hurtling toward this grim milestone in a war Putin refuses to stop, dragging his country deeper into the abyss with every passing day. So how has it come to this? How did one of the world's most feared military forces turn into a machine that consumes its own soldiers faster than it can replace them? And how long can Russia continue throwing men into the meat grinder before it collapses entirely? When you wage a futile war with brutal intensity and reckless persistence, the relentless slaughter of soldiers and civilians becomes an inescapable reality. Here's how Russia's President Vladimir Putin has driven his country and his people toward this devastating milestone, reminiscent of history's darkest years. As of August 28, 2024, Russia has lost precisely 618,960 troops in Ukraine, according to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces. This figure includes both fatalities and soldiers who've been so severely injured on the battlefield that they're no longer able to serve. If you're wondering about the proportion, The Economist reports that for every Russian soldier killed in action, there are roughly 3 to 4 wounded. A leaked document from the US Department of Defense leaves room for an even higher number of losses. According to this document, between 462,000 and 728,000 Russian troops have been killed, injured, or captured in Ukraine since the invasion began on February 24, 2022. That's substantially more troops than Putin initially prepared for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, with 190,000 soldiers moving into Ukrainian land on that fateful February day. These staggering figures make one thing abundantly clear. Ukrainian soldiers are making the invader pay heavily for every inch of ground gained, even if they're paying quite a high price in the process too. However, whether it's 600,000 or 728,000, this figure is still a few 100,000 soldiers short of 1 million. So how exactly could the projected loss of Russian troops reach this mind-blowing figure in a relatively short period? To answer this question, all we need is some simple maths. Let's use these figures presented by the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, as it's been publishing daily reports about the situation on the Ukrainian front line. Relying on these reports, we'll see how many troops Russia lost in a single week in Ukraine. As we mentioned, the last available report prior to writing these words was on August 28th. On this date, the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces put the total troop losses at 611,190 soldiers. Let's go back to August 21st to examine the trajectory of the Russian troop losses in a single week. On August 21st, the report published by the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces stated that Russia had lost 603,010 troops since the beginning of its invasion of Ukraine. The very next report, republished on August 22nd, put the total number of lost soldiers at 604,140. This means that in a single day, Russia lost 1,130 of its troops. This figure slightly increased the following day, as the August 23rd report pointed to a total loss of 605,330 troops. That's another 1,190 soldiers lost in a day. The next day showed a similar single loss day, with a reported 1,160 casualties. With this number, Russia lost a total of 606,490 troops. From August 25th to 27th, the total number of lost soldiers increased by 2,420. This means that the figure of 610,100 lost soldiers was reported on August 27th. On the last day prior to writing the script for this video, August 27th, Russia lost another 1,090 soldiers, leading to the 611,190 figure we mentioned a few times. So in total, that's 8,180 soldiers lost in a single week, or an average of 1,168 troops per day. Now let's say this loss rate continues uninterrupted. At an average of 1,168 troops lost per day, the staggering figure of 1 million casualties would be reached within 332 days, on July 26, 2025. If we use the figures coming from the US Defense Department as a starting point and keep the same loss rate, it will only take Russia 232 days to have 1 million of its soldiers wiped from the battlefield. This gives us the grim milestone of April 17, 2025. That's pretty much on par with the predictions of various experts, including Michael Clarke, a British academic who specializes in defense studies. In his interview with Times Radio, a British digital radio station, Professor Clarke claimed that Russia's troop losses could even reach 1 million by the end of 2024, given how little Putin cares for the human cost of his devastating military campaign. The new Chief of the General Staff of the British Army, General Sir Roland Walker, has laid out even more pessimistic forecasts for the Russian troops. General Walker believes that Putin will sacrifice between 1.5 and 1.8 million people in total to achieve his military goals in Ukraine, which is seizing the 4 primary regions or oblasts – Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia. His exact words were, "At the current rate of attrition of dead and wounded, that puts Russia probably well north of 1.5 million casualties to take the 4 oblasts in Ukraine, with untold billions of lost equipment." He also pointed out the absurdity of such a colossal human cost for a strategic aim that increasingly seems both unreachable and irrational. As General Walker put it, there have got to be more things for Russia to worry about than losing the best part of 1.5 to 1.8 million people for a slice of Ukraine with the way the world is going. Unfortunately, as things currently stand, it doesn't seem like it. In fact, it seems that Russia isn't particularly worried about losing all these troops either, although to be fair, the numbers coming from the Kremlin tell a whole different story. The only time the Kremlin publicly acknowledged its troop casualties was in early 2023, and the figure reported was almost insulting in its inaccuracy. At the time, the Kremlin claimed a mere 6,000 Russian soldiers had been killed in Ukraine, a figure that starkly contrasted independent estimates suggesting numbers tens of thousands higher. The disconnect between the official Kremlin figures and the actual losses on the battlefield only deepens the sense of tragedy, as the true scale of human suffering remains hidden behind propaganda and misinformation. Luckily, some Russian independent media outlets have taken great risks to report more accurate figures. As soon as the shameful 6,000 figure came out, Mika Golubovsky, an editor with the now banned Media Zona, immediately disputed it. Closely working with BBC Russia and relying on new graves in Russian cemeteries and open-source information from official reports, newspaper, and social media, Media Zona reported that over 50,000 Russian troops had died in Ukraine. That's 8 times more than what the Kremlin had claimed. Despite the inherent danger of challenging the official narrative in Russia, Golubovsky and other journalists continued their brave reporting. On July 5, 2024, both Media Zona and another independent media outlet, Meduza, published that approximately 120,000 Russian troops had died since the start of the invasion. That's pretty much on par with the figure that the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces reported at the time. The July 5th report from the staff put the total figure of killed and injured soldiers at 548,580. Using the deaths to injured ratio proposed by The Economist between 1 to 3 and 1 to 4, this suggests that between 109,716 and 137,145 Russian troops have been killed in action. Thanks to a slip-up from December 2023, it's safe to assume that Putin is well aware of the true scale of Russian troop losses, but he simply doesn't care. As Yevgenia Chirikova, an exiled Russian environmental activist, puts it, the growing number of killed and maimed on both sides does not bother Putin at all. Until Russian troops receive a tough rebuff in Ukraine, no changes will happen. But if Putin is so indifferent to this staggering human cost, why not just report it accurately? Why not use it to rally the nation around a narrative of sacrifice and patriotism, painting the war as a heroic struggle for Russia's survival? Well, this type of spin would have been possible some tens of thousands of dead soldiers ago. Now reporting actual figures can only backfire, revealing the full extent of the disaster that Putin's regime has tried so hard to conceal. But wait a minute, shouldn't the Russian people be well aware that their friends, family members, and neighbors are dropping like flies in Ukraine? Well, they are. But that's people outside Russia's 2 largest cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg. You see, Putin has been very careful not to conscript people from these major cities. Why? Because this way, he shields the urban elite from the direct impacts of the war, preventing a potential backlash from those who have the power to question and challenge his decisions. Additionally, not drafting young men from Moscow or St. Petersburg has caused many wealthy Russians to return to these cities after previously fleeing them to avoid the draft, thus offsetting the economic damage done by Western sanctions. But if Muscovites aren't the ones dying on the Ukrainian battlefield, who is? Who makes up the bulk of the hundreds of thousands of Russian troop casualties? To put it simply, they're troops that the Kremlin doesn't care about. Contract soldiers, foreigners, convicts, reservists, they're the ones filling the ranks and bearing the brunt of the casualties. As far as contract soldiers, or kontraktniki, as they're called in Russia, go, they receive little sympathy from the public or the Kremlin. After all, they chose to enlist and are well paid for their service. As Sergei Krivenko, a human rights activist from Moscow, puts it, ordinary people do not feel particularly sorry for them. And judging by the measures implemented by the Kremlin, Putin doesn't either. In May 2022, the 40-year age limit for contract soldiers was abolished, allowing applicants up to the age of 65 to enlist. Now you might wonder, why would anyone in their 60s willingly head to a conflict zone? The answer lies in the desperate economic circumstances faced by many Russians. For some, the prospect of a well-paying contract job in the military becomes a lifeline amidst financial hardship. In this regard, the broadening of eligibility reflects a grim calculus. When the cost of war becomes unsustainable, the Kremlin is willing to pull from increasingly desperate or less privileged demographics, prioritizing immediate military needs over long-term human costs. To make this brutal calculus possible, the Kremlin has been offering a monthly salary of at least $2,300. To put this figure into perspective, you need to know two facts. One, the salary of a contract soldier before the war in Ukraine was around $360. And two, the national average income in Russia is roughly $900 a month. And that's in regions that are better off. In poorer regions, it's half of that, $450. Throw the one-off recruitment bonus of at least $2,200 and high payouts in the event of disability, $33,000, and death, $55,000 into the mix, and it becomes clear why the Kremlin's offer is so tempting to those in desperate financial straits. That's also why the Kremlin is constantly hiking up the target figures for kontraktniki. In March 2020, Russia had approximately 405,000 of these soldiers. This figure was expected to rise to 500,000 by 2027. But then Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, so the target figures dramatically increased, while the time frame for achieving them significantly shortened. In December 2022, it was announced that 695,000 contract soldiers will be serving in the Russian armed forces by 2026. A year later, in December 2023, the number was increased to 745,000 troops by 2027. Even with all the incentives, it's easy to see why these figures are unlikely to be met without significant strain. That's why the Kremlin resorted to another shameful tactic, coercing individuals who might otherwise have never volunteered for service. In this sense, the war in Ukraine has started to resemble the Chechen wars, which were primarily fought by forced conscripts. As Krivenko puts it, these soldiers were sent to slaughter, which caused tension and backlash in society, even to the point of creating social movements. However, the Moscow elites are unlikely to launch any sort of social movements for the bulk of the troops coerced into conscription. Why? Because these are primarily made up of foreigners and convicts. According to numerous media reports, foreigners have been coerced to join the ranks of the Russian armed forces in one of three ways. First, they were deceived about the nature of their prospective employment. Second, they were promised Russian citizenship after only a year of service. Third, they were found guilty of breaking Russian law and given the choice between serving a prison sentence and serving in the war. The first disgraceful way is how a 21-year-old from Sri Lanka found himself on the Ukrainian battlefield. He joined the Russian armed forces for the second reason, receiving Russian citizenship, and was told he would only be employed in a non-combat role. Instead, he was thrust into the front lines, far from the safe, supportive role he'd been promised. That's how he ended up wounded and captured in Ukraine, which is why he also decided to share his story with DW, a German state-owned broadcaster under the watchful eye of Ukrainian military personnel. When he was first sent to the outskirts of the Russian-occupied Ukrainian city of Donetsk, he told his commander that he wanted to return to Sri Lanka. However, he was told that doing so could land him in prison for 15 years per the contract he had signed. So he stayed put, together with dozens of other citizens from India, Kyrgyzstan, Nepal and Tajikistan, all of whom were similarly trapped and betrayed by the Russian military's duplicitous promises. Besides false promises, the Kremlin also showed it had no problem changing the rules of the game whenever it felt like it. Before the war, foreign military recruits had to complete a 5-year contract in the armed forces to obtain Russian citizenship. Once Russian soldiers started dying in bulk, this period was reduced to only 1 year of service. But here's the kicker. Sure, they will receive citizenship after a year, However, they'll still have to continue serving, as Putin stipulated that contracts of all kontraktniki will remain valid until the end of his so-called special military operation in Ukraine. During this period, no contracts can be cancelled, and all of those about to expire must be renewed. In other words, foreign fighters don't get to start over in a new country, they get to die as Russians. Russian convicts went through something similar. Initially, the Kremlin was recruiting convicts by promising them a pardon after serving for 6 months, even if they had been convicted of the most violent crimes. However, as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, the rules changed. The only way for most of these convicts to receive a clean slate was to serve until the end of the war in Ukraine. Also, for many of them, a full pardon was off the table, with only a reduction in their sentences or some other form of leniency being offered. Now, some might see this as just, as people who committed heinous crimes shouldn't be allowed to escape their past so easily. However, the fate of these individuals should be viewed in a greater context. Their situation shows just how easy it is for the Kremlin to exploit the power it inevitably holds over those in desperate circumstances. These prison recruits have not only been thrust into a perilous conflict under false assurances, but they've been practically used as cannon fodder in a war that offers them no real chance of survival or redemption. Ever since Putin ordered the now late Yevgeny Prigozhin to start recruiting prisoners in June 2022, these inmates turned soldiers became prime meat for the Kremlin's grinder. According to the BBC, the inmates recruited by Prigozhin survived in Ukraine for an average of 3 months. Those recruited by Russia's Ministry of Defense after its rift with Prigozhin survived for only 2 months on average. Though several conclusions can be drawn based on the difference between the two figures, the only one that matters is that both the ministry and the Wagner Group, previously led by Prigozhin, treated convicts as nothing more than an expendable force to be thrown into battle. As one soldier who wasn't part of the storm platoons made up entirely of convicts puts it, "Storm fighters, they're just meat." This brings us to another crucial aspect to discuss. How are all these tens of thousands of soldiers dying in Ukraine? By now, the number one way Russian troops are being killed in Ukraine is probably obvious: the infamous meat grinder military tactic. And if that name isn't graphic enough for you, let's paint a clearer picture. The meat grinder refers to the brutal, attritional approach where waves of soldiers are sent into fiercely contested areas, often under relentless artillery fire and close-quarters combat. This strategy is designed to wear down the enemy through sheer numbers and reveal its firing positions, but it comes at a horrific cost. After employing this strategy in the second year of the war in Ukraine, the Russian body count increased by nearly 25%. However, Russia also scored some significant victories in Avdiivka and Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. While helping Russian armed forces to capture Bakhmut in the spring of 2023, the Wagner Group lost 22,000 of its soldiers due to this merciless tactic. And that's where the problem lies. The semblance of success has only added more bodies into the meat grinder. The worst part, the Kremlin is so blinded by these fleeting triumphs that it continues to perpetuate this devastating tactic in Kharkiv, even though it's already proven unsuccessful in the region. The meat grinder tactic also failed in the Battle of WARLORDS, which is still being waged in the Donetsk region of Ukraine. According to the Institute for the Study of War, these ineffective human wave-style frontal assaults have been unsuccessful in the city due to challenging terrain, a lack of combat power, and failure to surprise Ukrainian forces. From this quote alone, 2 more elements that have been sowing death among the Russian troops become apparent: the lack of combat power and the mighty Ukrainian forces. As far as the first element goes, there have been numerous reports that Russian troops are sent to the front with insufficient training and equipment, and that's putting it lightly. The BBC reports that some of the prisoners recruited for the war in Ukraine had to beg their relatives to buy them proper uniforms and boots. And if the Russian military can't provide something as basic as adequate gear for its troops, it's hardly surprising that they are woefully equipped with inadequate weapons and munitions. According to Vladimir Grubnik, a Russian war supporter and blogger, many soldiers were sent to combat with rifles unsuitable for modern warfare. Others received broken rifles, which can't be either repaired or replaced. Throw the lack of a proper kit and medical supplies into the mix, and you'll understand the shock in Grubnik's words. What a foot soldier should do on the front line without a first aid kit, a spade to dig a trench, and with a broken rifle is a big mystery. You might recall the famous quote, "Wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men." Right about now, let us stop you there. The soldiers fighting for Russia in Ukraine can barely call themselves that. The only thing that sets these individuals apart from regular people is a fortnight of military training, if that. There are no professional and highly skilled soldiers fighting for their country anymore. No, they're already dead. Now there are only poorly trained individuals recruited with a single goal in mind: to send as many soldiers to the front line as quickly as possible. And what will happen to those soldiers at the front line? That isn't Putin's concern. His only concern is the figures that he can use to boast about Russia's might, but the world sees right through this propaganda. In a statement released on July 12, 2024, the UK Ministry of Defence slammed this approach as ineffective. The statement said, "Although this new approach has increased pressure on the front lines, an effective Ukrainian defence and a lack of Russian training reduces Russia's ability to exploit any tactical successes despite attempting to stretch the front line further." Again, there's the crucial element that has led to many Russian soldiers perishing: an effective Ukrainian defence. Ever since Kyiv didn't fall in a matter of days as initially predicted, one thing became abundantly clear: Ukrainians aren't going down without a fight. And let us tell you, they might be sacrificing a lot, but they're also taking numerous Russian soldiers with them. Telegram, the messaging platform prevalent in Russia, is often flooded by desperate accounts of the surviving Russians about how their units are being terrorized by Ukrainian drones, machine guns, and artillery. However, the Kremlin is known to adapt and overcome, and recently it came up with a new idea of how to locate and neutralize Ukrainian forces, showering them with fire. And to no surprise, this approach involves sacrificing more soldiers. But this time it's not waves of soldiers being sent in to overwhelm a specific position. This time, small detachments of troops are dismounting from their vehicles and advancing on foot toward the Ukrainian firing position. And no, this isn't some kind of Mission Impossible approach, where precision and stealth rule the day. Instead, these soldiers are relentlessly pushed forward to essentially be sacrificed in an effort to locate the Ukrainian firing positions and hit them with artillery. Now, Russia might have substantially more citizens than Ukraine, but it still can't keep up this horrific strategy forever. The staggering loss of life and the constant need for fresh recruits are taking a toll, revealing the limits of a strategy built on sacrifice and brutality. For now, the Kremlin is effortlessly feeding the meat grinder with fresh meat on a regular basis, recruiting up to 30,000 new soldiers a month. But soon the pool of available recruits will dwindle, and the brutal reality of the conflict will come crashing down, leaving the Kremlin to grapple with the consequences of its unrelenting and deadly tactics. Putin is seemingly well aware of this fact, which is why the Russian armed forces are pushing quite hard to make real progress before they run out of time. But the lack of troops isn't the only thing holding them back. The Russian armed forces have also tried to apply pressure everywhere all at once during their summer offensive, causing them to stretch their resources thin and fail to achieve any sustained gains. In a month or two, the weather will also join the fray, further complicating their efforts. Once the heavy rain starts and the ground gets wet, the muddy terrain will become treacherous for both infantry and vehicles. This will not only hamper movement, but also make it difficult to execute any effective combat operation, which the Russians struggle to do even without the rain. And of course, there's always the fact that Russia is gradually plateauing its arms production, leaving the military with fewer resources to replace destroyed munitions and equipment. The relentless pace of the war in Ukraine, combined with sanctions and production bottlenecks, means that the Kremlin's war machine isn't as self-sustaining as it once was. The front lines are practically eating through military stockpiles faster than they can be replenished, forcing Russia into a dangerous reliance on outdated, Soviet-era weaponry and fragile foreign supply chains from China, North Korea, and Iran. In other words, Russia isn't only running out of soldiers, it's running out of everything. No matter how many men Putin throws into the fire, the war is bleeding the country dry. Still, the troop losses are undoubtedly the most tragic and horrifying reality of all. Each new conscript is sent to the front with less training, fewer supplies, and dwindling hope. Russia's war machine, once feared, now consumes its own people faster than it can replace them. These soldiers aren't just losing battles, they're being swallowed whole by a war that has no end in sight. And the most terrifying part, as more lives are sacrificed, nearing the 1 million mark, the Kremlin continues to push forward, turning a blind eye to the devastation and leaving nothing but a wasteland of broken men and shattered families in its wake. But what is your stance on these soldiers? Do you see them as victims of a ruthless regime or mere instruments of war, complicit in their own destruction? And when do you see the 1 million troop mark being passed? By the end of 2024 or sometime during 2025?
Russia's weapons production has increased dramatically. Russia's defense industry gears up for a long war. The scale of Russia's rearmament has NATO worried. These are just some of the headlines that flooded the internet as Russia's weapons industry saw a boom in 2024 instead of the doom many Western experts had predicted. Of course, no one can fault the writers behind these articles, as one look at the figures coming out of Moscow paints a picture of a thriving war machine that has made an almost miraculous recovery. factories running at full tilt, assembly lines churning out artillery shells, tanks, and missiles at an unprecedented pace. In the artillery department, Russia has even bested the US, producing about 250,000 shells per month, which is nearly 3 times the quantity the US produces for Ukraine, and that's combined with Europe. However, beneath the glossy reports and the numbers that seem to defy expectations, whispers of resource shortages, outdated technology, and rampant corruption tell a far different story. Russia's weapons industry might have been propped up by sheer force of will and held together by desperate measures and hollow propaganda, but it is, in fact, teetering on the edge of collapse. And the truth is that this industry was always going to fail, no matter how much the Kremlin tried to mask its decay. After all, no empire can thrive on rotting foundations. But why is Russia's weapons industry failing so badly? And what deeper forces are driving it toward inevitable collapse? Keep watching to find out. To understand just how different reality is from what's being portrayed, let's look at the propaganda coming from the Kremlin, and then gradually peel back its layers and examine the crumbling foundations of Russia's weapons industry. According to the Kremlin, Russia's weapons industry has never been stronger. The historic increase in Russia's military expenditure alone should serve as proof. In 2022, Russia adopted an expenditure plan that allocates $600 billion for national defense, security, and law enforcement between 2022 and 25. About $75 billion was planned for 2022 and $84 billion for 2023. In 2024, a record-high pre-planned military expenditure was introduced, with reports pointing to a $140 billion figure. This would mean that 35% of all government spending in 2024 was directed toward fueling the military machine. An enormous commitment that, on the surface, signals Russia's determination to sustain its military power. With all this money pouring into the defense sector, it shouldn't be surprising that the official data on arms production, coming from the Kremlin, also paints a picture of tremendous success. According to Russia's Ministry of Digital Development, Communications and Mass Media, in 2023 alone, the production of armored vehicles in Russia increased 3-fold. For drones, it increased 2-fold. In communications equipment, weapons, electronic warfare, and reconnaissance, more than 5-fold growth. Those were the exact words of Russia's Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin at a meeting discussing the needs of Russia's armed forces. He added that the volume of production of armor protection items also increased 3-fold, which was good news for all the Russian soldiers, fearing they would be sent into battle, ill-equipped and vulnerable, like many of their predecessors in the conflict. To keep up with these intense production volumes, the Kremlin has reportedly engaged over 360 enterprises, commissioning approximately 37,000 units of various equipment. This has allowed another 520,000 employees to be involved in the defense sector, pushing the limits of production capacity. The result, Russia's weapons industry is not only fulfilling its quotas, but it's doing so ahead of schedule. That's if you believe a word of the official reports coming from the Kremlin. Remember, that's the same Kremlin that presented mind-blowing figures regarding mass mobilization in Russia. 137,000 troops in August of 2022, another 170,000 soldiers in December of 2023, and plans to mobilize another 400,000 before 2024 ends. On paper, all these figures paint a picture of an unstoppable and ever-growing military force. Yet beneath the surface of these impressive numbers lies a different story, one of poorly chosen, poorly equipped, and poorly supported troops used by the Kremlin as nothing more than cannon fodder. Older people, disabled people, convicts. These are just some of the groups conscripted to swell the ranks, revealing a disturbing reality behind the grandiose figures. Russia's weapons industry is no different. However, to be fair, Russia's approach of quantity over quality has allowed the defense industry to flood the battlefield with an impressive array of weaponry, ammunition, and equipment. As for how these performed on the battlefield, that's a story for later. Strictly numbers-wise, the Ukrainian battlefield is expected to see the following equipment in 2024. 800,000 units of 122mm ammunition for barrel artillery, 500,000 122mm rockets for the BM-21 Grad multiple launch rocket system, 17,000 200mm rockets for the BM-27 Uragan self-propelled multiple launch rocket system, 1,500 tanks, and 3,000 other armored vehicles. These figures become even more concerning when compared to those from previous years. For instance, only 33,122mm rockets for the BM-21 were manufactured in 2023, which means that their production is expected to skyrocket by 1,415%. Again, that's if you choose to believe the Kremlin-controlled figures. We must keep emphasizing where these figures are coming from, as it's pretty easy to get lost in all the numbers, also losing sight of their reliability. As previously noted, the Kremlin's numbers serve a single purpose: to bolster a narrative of strength while disregarding deeper issues like quality control and inefficiency. But is projecting power the only reason why Russia is seemingly putting all its resources into weapons production? In a word, no. The truth is that Russia needs the weapons industry to survive. Even before the war in Ukraine started, Russia was incapable of exporting other high value-added products like cars or cell phones. Weapons have always been a cornerstone of Russia's export industry, which was spearheaded by oil and gas exports. But now, when most of the world wants nothing to do with Russian goods and natural resources due to sanctions and geopolitical tensions, weapons are practically all Russia has. As of 2024, Russia's defense industry employs an estimated 3.5 million people, which accounts for 20% of all manufacturing jobs in Russia. All the tanks, planes, and ammunition manufactured, together with military pay and compensation for dead and wounded soldiers, directly contribute to Russia's gross domestic product, or GDP figures. In other words, the war in Ukraine is single-handedly driving Russia's economic growth. But what about arms exports? Are the weapons production figures reflecting a booming export sector as well? The answer is a resounding no. However, the reason behind this answer is multifaceted. On one hand, Russia can't afford to sell virtually any weapons, as it needs all its production for its own military needs. With the ongoing conflict in Ukraine depleting resources and driving up demand for armaments, the domestic priority is to ensure that the Russian military is well equipped and has ample supplies. This is especially vital when you consider the billions of dollars Ukraine is receiving from its Western allies in military aid. On the other hand, even if Russia wanted to sell weapons in bulk, it wouldn't be able to. Why? Because hardly anyone would rush to buy them. But how is this possible? After all, we're talking about the producer of arguably the most famous assault rifle in the world, the AK-47. The country that, alongside the US and France, contributed to nearly 2/3 of the global major weapons exports between 2019 and 2023. Well, you see, once your weapons actually get battle-tested, while the whole world is watching and fail spectacularly, their reputation can tarnish rather quickly. And that's on top of the sanctions that reduced the number of countries purchasing major Russian arms from 31 in 2019 to 12 in 2023. Among these countries, India and China lead the pack, with $5 and $3.1 billion respectively, according to data acquired between 2019 and 23. However, even these two major importers significantly reduced the amount of weapons they purchased from Russia in 2023. For comparison's sake, India imported $405 million worth of major weapons in 2023, a 62.5% decrease from the $1.08 billion spent in 2022. Similarly, China spent $372 million on Russia's weapons and equipment in 2023, while their imports almost reached $600 million in 2022, $580 million to be exact. So how poorly do Russia's weapons have to have performed in order to keep these other countries away? The answer is glaringly obvious in the field. Even during the first year of war in Ukraine, when the weapons used were supposed to be new and fresh, showcasing Russian military prowess, the country's equipment saw some excessively high failure rates. Take Russian missiles as an example. According to the Pentagon, these missiles experienced 20 to 60% failure rates in the first month of the conflict alone. In this context, failure was defined as the inability to successfully launch the missile or hit the target intended. Out of these faulty missiles, cruise missiles performed the worst, with air-launched cruise missiles having the lowest kill rates. There have even been reports that some of the roughly 1,100 missiles Russia launched in the first month of the invasion managed to hit the target but forgot about the other crucial part, actually exploding. The Pentagon explained this phenomenon as a result of both quality control issues and fusing problems. Still, in their March 25, 2022 report, the Pentagon officials warned Russia still had about 50% of their missile inventory available. And despite the high failure rates and performance issues observed, such a high amount of the remaining stockpile still represented a substantial threat. Well, by May 10th of that year, this threat all but vanished, as the Pentagon reported that Russia had almost depleted its missile inventory. Unsurprisingly, Russia was no longer eager to shoot off what little remained left and right, given the abysmal performance and dwindling stockpile. So the missile use continued at a significantly reduced rate. Now the performance of the Russian missiles is disastrous in and of itself. However, it reaches a whole new level when you consider all the praises the Russian military lavished upon their missile technology before the conflict. Former Deputy Prime Minister, now the Director General of the State Corporation for Space Activities, Roscosmos, Yuri Borisov, described Russia's hypersonic missiles as high precision, claiming that they can be used to eliminate enemy targets such as parked vehicles, arms depots, command posts, infrastructure targets, with the error probability of just a few meters. He added that these missiles, primarily referring to the likes of the Bal, Bastion, Iskander, Kalibr, KH-101, and Kinzhal missiles can travel hundreds of kilometers and have next to zero CEP. CEP refers to circular error probability, which measures the radius within which a missile is expected to land around its target, indicating its precision. So a missile with a CEP that's close to zero is supposed to always hit its intended target with remarkable accuracy. However, the war in Ukraine proved that these praises were nothing more than wishful thinking. Although, to be fair, even pre-war reports had hinted at the possibility that Russia's missiles might not live up to their lofty claims. For example, in 2017, Igor Rosin, a Russian military journalist, reviewed Russia's most devastating sea, ground, and air missiles. When talking about the Kalibr naval cruise missile, he said that it had an accuracy of 30 meters, which is roughly 100 feet. When discussing the KH-101 air-based missiles, he described them as being able to eliminate targets up to 5,500 kilometers or 3,400 miles away with an accuracy of 5 to 50 meters, which is 16 to 164 feet. Now, 5 meters might not be too much, but 50 is certainly quite far from the supposed near-zero CEP. In fact, 50 meters is not even close to the precision needed for high-value targets. This sort of expectation versus reality gap is, without a doubt, one of the leading reasons why Russia's weapons industry is failing so badly. However, it's far from the only one. With this in mind, let's dive into the factors contributing to the downfall of the Russian defense sector. To start, let's expand on the first reason we mentioned. Russia's weapons in practice simply can't match the expectations on paper, which has led most of the country's arms importers to rethink their purchases. Even if you know a little about the technicalities of weaponry, think about it logically. How did a country once touted as the second biggest military power in the world fail to quickly defeat Ukraine, a nation with drastically fewer resources and a smaller military? Russia's propaganda was so effective that even Western commentators saw Kyiv falling rather quickly. After all, Russia's claims and previous military actions, like its swift victory in Georgia, mighty intervention in Syria, and its aggressive posture in Crimea, had set a precedent for rapid success. But let's look underneath the surface. At 26,900 square miles of area, Georgia is a tiny country, almost 10 times smaller than Ukraine. Plus, at the time of Russia's invasion in 2008, it had a minuscule army of under 30,000, which was additionally poorly organized. As for Syria, Russia was up against a fragmented opposition rather than a unified, well-organized military force. That's not to mention that the Syrian insurgents' air capabilities were almost non-existent, and practically all Russia did in the country was launch airstrikes. According to Valery Gerasimov, the Chief of General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, the country's Air Force, RUAF, had delivered 71,000 strikes on the supposed terrorist infrastructure in under a year and a half. Finally, in Crimea, the situation was markedly different as well. The annexation in 2014 was largely unopposed, characterized by a swift, well-coordinated operation that relied heavily on local support and covert tactics rather than a full-scale military engagement. The Ukrainian forces in Crimea were relatively few, between 5,000 and 22,000, and lacked the capability to mount a significant defense against the Russian forces, which were able to leverage both military superiority and the element of surprise effectively. In other words, the combat conditions encountered by the Russian military in Ukraine were far more challenging than they had previously experienced. For the first time, the Russian military actually had to rely on its full array of conventional forces in a prolonged and high-intensity conflict against a well-organized and determined adversary. This exposed the limitations of Russia's weaponry, tactics, and logistical support that had previously been masked by less demanding scenarios. That's why Russia failed on almost every front in Ukraine. It failed to claim any substantial victories, make and maintain significant territorial gains, achieve air supremacy, defend its naval assets in the Black Sea against a country with no navy, land, air, sea, fail. With this in mind, why would any serious prospective buyer want to invest in Russian weaponry that's proven ineffective in a high-stakes conflict? The failures of the Russian military across multiple fronts not only undermine its own capabilities, but also cast doubt on the reliability of its arms. But let's take the buyers out of the mix. Let's say Russia is strictly producing weapons to sustain its war efforts and thus its economy. Even by these standards, Russia's weapons industry would still be considered a failure. Why? Because its products simply cannot match the sophisticated Western arms. And since countering and even surpassing Western weaponry is a key objective for Russia, it's easy to conclude that it's all for nothing. All the pompous claims, grand military parades, and inflated statistics mean nothing when Russia's weapons industry ultimately falls short of producing large-scale targeting systems, precision-guided munitions, and heavy-strike long-range drones. Take the Sukhoi Su-57 stealth fighter jet as an example. This project was initiated back in 1999 under the guise of a revolutionary advancement in stealth and multi-role capabilities. Marketed as Russia's answer to the Western Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II, the Su-57 promised to deliver unparalleled superiority with its stealth features, advanced avionics, and supersonic cruise capabilities. And then over 20 years passed, and all Russia had to show for these ambitious promises was a handful of Su-57 prototypes. In December 2019, just a year before the aircraft would be officially launched, the first serial Su-57, bort number 01 Blue, crashed some 70 miles from the Zyomgy airport in Khabarovsk Krai during the final stage of its factory trials. The reason? A control system malfunctioned at an altitude of 26,000 feet. As a result of the malfunction, the aircraft entered a rapid spiral descent, causing the pilot to eject at an altitude of about 6,500 feet. This crash was emblematic of the broader challenges facing Russia's defense industry, where ambitious projects frequently struggle to deliver on their lofty promises. For an aircraft that was supposed to rival the best Western fighters, the Su-57's troubled development and operational hiccups illustrate the gap between Russia's aspirations and its practical achievements in defense technology. To this day, only 22 serial Su-57 jets have been manufactured, and reports have yet to come out about their operation in a real combat scenario. In contrast, the US has built over 1,000 F-35s, which are actively used and tested in various theaters of operation around the world. However, as much as Russia wants to beat its Western opponents, one simple fact remains true. The country's weapons industry is failing miserably without Western-made parts. As foreign policy puts it, Russia's war machine runs on Western parts. Now you might wonder, how is this possible if over 50 countries, including most of Western nations, imposed sanctions on Russia? Well, Russia has managed to find a workaround, relying on a network of third-party countries and intermediaries to source the crucial components they need. This has led to multiple calls to increase funding for oversight agencies and punish those who facilitate these indirect transactions with multi-billion-dollar penalties similar to those issued to banks for money laundering and terrorist financing. This also means Russia's weapons industry is practically running out of time, and in a high-stakes game, time is of the essence. The increasing difficulty in acquiring critical components will likely eventually force Russia to either drastically reduce its production capabilities or seek alternative methods to bolster its defense sector, with both options posing significant challenges to the survival of Russia's weapons industry and, thus, economy. But how dependent on Western components is Russia's arms production truly? Unique 2023 Ukrainian resources titled "Components in the Aggressor's Weapon and Instruments of War" hold the answer to this question. That answer is 3,638 different Western components in 134 distinct weapon systems. In other words, Russia's military is about 70 to 90% dependent on Western-made parts. Take the Shahed 238 unmanned aerial vehicle, or UAV for short, as an example. With the help of Iran, their source country, Russia has started producing these drones domestically, aiming to manufacture at least 6,000 units by the end of 2025. To achieve this goal, Russia will need electronic components from Western and other foreign countries like Canada, China, Germany, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and the US. Even when Russia tries to deploy new types of weapons, such as the Kh-69 and Zircon missiles, they can't do it without Western-made components. In fact, these systems require even more sophisticated and specialized technologies that can only be sourced from Western nations. Therefore, finding a way to fully prevent Russia from accessing Western-made components would undoubtedly spell doom for the country's arms production. For now, Russia's still getting away with sourcing Western-made counterparts, with a June 2024 report by the Royal United Services Institute, a London-based think tank, disclosing, despite the diligent efforts of many civil servants, backed by the political will to disrupt Russia's military-industrial output, there is little to show for it. However, even the little damage that Western sanctions have done to Russia shouldn't be underestimated. Sweeping Western sanctions have undoubtedly pushed Russia's weapons industry to the brink of collapse, although they did fail to push it over entirely. As a result of these sanctions, the Russian military-industrial complex is facing severe delays, rampant costs, and substantial operational inefficiencies. The result? The Russians have been cutting corners more and more, jeopardizing the long-term quality of the weapons they produce. So in 2024, it might seem that Russia has managed to outwit its Western adversaries through sheer volume of production, but most of the weapons being produced in heaps in Russian factories have virtually no chance of maintaining the standards necessary for modern warfare. Not now, not ever. But Western sanctions aren't the only ones to blame for the abysmal output of Russian arms factories. How the Kremlin treats its factory workers also has something to do with it. Remember, we're talking about the same Kremlin that's favored the meat grinder military strategy throughout the duration of the war in Ukraine, sending wave after wave of soldiers with little regard for their survival or well-being. And if that's how the Kremlin treats frontline soldiers, the very people tasked with achieving military victories, just imagine how it treats the factory workers behind the scenes. Sure, these factory workers are well paid, with machinists and welders reportedly earning more than white-collar managers and lawyers in Russia. However, Russia's soldiers are also well paid, and yet they are still treated as expendable assets. In arms production, this means introducing 6-day work weeks with 12-hour shifts, rushing employees through the training process, and even resorting to forced labor to meet the deadlines. For instance, Kurgan-Mashzavod, the Russian manufacturing facility producing the BMP-2 and BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, has brought in convicts to fill the labor shortages. These prisoners, often with little to no experience, are thrown into the production process under grueling conditions, all in the name of speeding up output. However, it's important to note that the responsibility for these cruel actions doesn't lie solely with the management. The Russian government was the one to crank up the pressure, with Dmitry Medvedev, former president and current deputy chairman of the Security Council of Russia, touring the factory in 2022 and warning the management about the potential criminal charges that come with failing to meet production deadlines. Medvedev's message was clear: the Kremlin demanded results, regardless of the human cost. This leads us to the underlying reason why Russia's weapons industry is on the verge of collapse, and why this was always going to be its fate: the systematic challenges embedded within its military-industrial complex. Simply put, this complex is failing due to a deeply flawed system of state-run monopolies, corruption, and inefficiencies. This systemic failure is rooted in Russia's resistance to embrace free market capitalism, which has stunted innovation and productivity in the defense sector. On one side, the US maintains a partnership between the government and private companies. For instance, Washington renewed its fighter jet fleet through a competitive bidding process, awarding the F-35 contract to Lockheed Martin after an open contest with private companies like Boeing. Sure, this system has its own drawbacks, including cost overruns of $400 billion seen in the F-35 program. However, it's also driven the US to produce some of the most advanced weaponry in the world. Decades of competition among private arms firms have incentivized innovation and efficiency, leading to cutting-edge technologies like stealth fighters, precision-guided missiles, and drones. And then there's Russia, a country where the defense industry operates strictly under state monopolies and centralization, continuing a legacy from the Soviet era. Communism might have fallen a long time ago, but Russia has certainly not embraced free market principles. Instead, the state maintains control over most industries, including defense, through massive conglomerates like Rostec, established in 2007 to consolidate over 700 arms companies. The logic behind Rostec was to eliminate inefficiencies through centralized control, but this has only compounded the problem. Now there are more inefficiencies in Russia's weapons industry than ever before. This also has to do with the people put in charge of the country's defense industry. Instead of fostering competition, Russia's President Vladimir Putin's approach was to replace communist ideologues with pragmatic technocrats, or siloviki, who are mostly ex-KGB agents just like him. Of course, this includes the CEO of Rostec, Sergei Chemezov, who is a former KGB colleague of Putin. By 2014, Rostec had reduced its workforce to 443,000 employees from 788,000 in 2008. However, despite these cuts, Rostec managed to achieve an even greater monopolization of the defense sector. For example, the United Aircraft Corporation, under Rostec's control, is the only manufacturer of Russian fighter jets. In the US, on the other hand, there's a diverse array of contractors like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Raytheon. Another glaring example of inefficiency within Russia's military-industrial complex is Almaz-Antey, Russia's leading missile manufacturer. This corporation is directly owned by Russia's Ministry of Finance and led by another Silovik, Viktor Ivanov. In 2017, its subsidiary, MPO Novator, managed to produce only 60 caliber missiles in 6 months, an abysmally low output, given that Russia fired over 1,200 missiles in just 1 month of the Ukraine war. This mismatch between production capacity and battlefield needs reveals the inability of Russia's monopolistic defense industry to meet modern demands. However, no systematic challenge has plagued every aspect of Russian society like corruption. And there's no doubt about it, corruption and cronyism also permeate every inch of the military-industrial complex. That's how the late Yevgeny Prigozhin, Putin's former ally, and his catering company were appointed to provide food to Russian soldiers, bypassing traditional systems. And that's how the same Russian soldiers ended up with expired food while risking their lives for their country. According to Russia's former Minister of Foreign Affairs Andrei Kozyrevim, corruption paired with the fear of actually telling Putin about it has transformed Russia's military into a Potemkin military. If you're unfamiliar with the term, Potemkin military refers to a military force that, on the surface, appears formidable and well prepared, but is hollow and dysfunctional in reality. The term originates from Grigory Potemkin, a Russian nobleman who supposedly built fake villages along the route of Empress Catherine the Great's journey to Crimea to impress her with the region's prosperity. And that's all Russia's weapons industry is, a carefully constructed facade that's beginning to crumble. And let us tell you, once this facade finally caves in, it will take the Russian economy with it. After all, this economy is now fully militarized, and much of its industrial capacity is dedicated to defense production. While the defense sector falters, the effects will ripple through the entire economic system. Renaud Foucault, a senior lecturer in economics at Lancaster University, perhaps put it best: Russia's economy is now completely driven by the war in Ukraine. It cannot afford to lose, but nor can it afford to win. If Russia achieves victory, the staggering costs associated with rebuilding and maintaining control over a conquered Ukraine would be insurmountable for an already weakened economy. Conversely, if Russia loses, it risks not only the collapse of its military-industrial complex, but also the loss of the very driving force behind its economic stability and growth. Now it's time for you to do the talking. Head to the comments section below and let us know whether you believe doom is the only option for Russia's weapons industry.
For months, a large-scale Russian summer offensive was all anyone was talking about. Ever since the reputable US think tank, the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW for short, warned about the Kremlin's plans, the media has been in a frenzy, labeling the ensuing period as key in the Russo-Ukrainian war and saying that it could even end the war in Ukraine. Western analysts speculated, the Ukrainian government prepared, and the world held its breath. The anticipation was palpable, the tension unbearable, and then nothing. Sure, the much-anticipated summer offensive did come, with a combined force of 40,000 Russian troops launching an assault across Ukraine's northern border on May 9th, Russia's Victory Day, symbolizing the country's triumph over Nazi Germany in World War II. Of course, the date was chosen deliberately to evoke a sense of historical destiny and inevitable success over the neo-Nazi regime, which is what Russian President Vladimir Putin claimed Ukraine has become. Yet despite the dramatic timing and intense build-up, the offensive spluttered and evoked the name of William Shakespeare's famous comedy, Much Ado About Nothing. Even NATO's top officials like Christopher Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, weren't sure whether the offensive had actually begun or not, which speaks volumes about its underwhelming execution and lack of impact. Though Russia did make some advances and continues to do so, this summer offensive can, for the most part, be labeled as a colossal failure. Why? And how is it possible for the offensive previously hailed as the war-ending blow to come to a halt after barely a few miles in? That's precisely what you'll find out in this video. You'll also learn how and why the offensive started in the first place, what it aimed to achieve, and what's in store for the future of this conflict. Let's begin. The number one question that probably comes to mind when hearing about a Russian summer offensive is, how was Russia even able to launch it? After all, the Russian armed forces had faced significant setbacks in the preceding months and, let's face it, the entire invasion of Ukraine. According to a May 8th report by the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, by the invasion date, Russia had lost as many as 477,430 troops in Ukraine. Similar losses in equipment were reported as well, with Russia bidding farewell to 7,418 tanks, 14,246 armored fighting vehicles, 16,549 vehicles and fuel tanks, 12,317 artillery systems, 1,057 multiple launch rocket systems, 792 air defense systems, 349 aircraft, 325 helicopters, 9,728 drones, 26 ships and boats, and 1 submarine. So how was Russia able to pull off an offensive in the summer of 2024? The answer is simple. Russia did what Russia does best: exploit vulnerabilities. You see, Russia has suffered immense losses since February 24, 2022, when the invasion first started. But so did Ukraine. The defending force was grappling with a shortage of men and ammunition, allowing Russia to capitalize on these weaknesses. However, there was one thing that primarily gave Russia the initiative to launch its summer offensive: the delay in Western aid. The US, Ukraine's largest donor, with over $43 billion in military aid provided in just 2 years, faced a challenging period starting in the fall of 2023 when new aid packages were held up. This delay was primarily due to the intense debates in Congress, where some members questioned the continuation of military support in the face of competing domestic priorities. During these discussions, concerns over immigration and border security took center stage, leading to a temporary pause in aid decisions. Unfortunately, while these debates were ongoing, the Ukrainian battlefield faced significant challenges. The delay in military supplies allowed Russia to capitalize on its temporary advantage in firepower, escalating attacks along the 600-mile front. These operations started in October 2023 and had a single goal: to demoralize Ukraine in the West. As months passed and no aid arrived, the Russian armed forces became wrongly convinced that their plan was working. That's where the idea for the summer offensive was likely conceived. Thanks to making some tactical gains in midwinter, the Kremlin seemingly became convinced that it could eventually collapse the Ukrainian defense line, as an ISW report puts it, and so the preparations began. Obviously, the ultimate goal was to cause a general collapse of the Ukrainian front line and achieve a grand Russian breakthrough after months of suffering humiliating losses. But what were the specific military objectives of the summer offensive? The truth is, no one outside the Kremlin knows. The summer offensive has been executed so poorly that all we're left with is guesswork and speculation about its true military objectives. According to Michael Kaufman, a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Russia's goal was only to stretch out Ukraine's forces and deal a decisive blow to its combat strength. Others saw the summer offensive as a blitzkrieg attempt whose ultimate goal was Kyiv, the city that Putin has long coveted as the ultimate prize. He holds an almost mystical reverence for Kyiv, considering it the very heart of Russian civilization. However, the prevailing view is that the Russian summer offensive is nothing but a ruse. You see, the offensive was launched in the Kharkiv Oblast, opening a new northern front in Ukraine. However, many analysts believe that seizing Kharkiv isn't the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is for the Ukrainian troops to believe Russia is after Kharkiv, compelling them to redeploy their eastern forces to the north. With Ukraine's position in the east weakened, Russia would be able to achieve its true goal, capturing, or as the Kremlin puts it, liberating the entire Donetsk Oblast. Seizing Donetsk has long been one of Putin's main goals, as it would solidify Russia's control over a crucial part of eastern Ukraine and bolster the Kremlin's strategic position in the region. After Donetsk, there's Luhansk, and before you know it, the Kremlin could potentially establish a contiguous corridor of control through the Donbas region. Of course, there are also those who believe that the Russian commanders purposefully made the goals of the summer offensive unclear, allowing them to change them depending on the Ukrainian response. While this approach can be viewed as flexible, it likely reflects a lack of clear strategy and tendency toward opportunistic, reactive planning rather than decisive, well-thought-out objectives, aka the Russian special. But to be honest, by now, it doesn't even matter what the initial goals were or whether they even existed. All that matters is that Russia failed to achieve them. Before discussing why, let's do a brief overview of the course of the summer offensive and the tactics used to understand how the situation unfolded and went wrong. As mentioned, the offensive officially started on May 9th. However, May 10th was when the Russian forces started shelling positions in the direction of the city of Vovchansk in the Kharkiv Oblast using guided bombs. The very same day, the Russian troops attempted to break through the front line, with about 5 Russian infantry battalions crossing the state border and capturing the villages of Borisivka, Krasna, Pilna, and Strilecha. From there, Russia made some of its biggest territorial gains in 18 months. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Russian forces seized control of roughly 10 villages by May 17th, advancing some 6 miles into the Kharkiv Oblast. However, it's important to note that these villages were mostly lightly defended small settlements. The offensive operations continued every day throughout May, but no changes to the front lines were recorded. With this in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that Russia's much-anticipated summer offensive stalled by early June, before the summer even officially began. By June 6th, the Russian forces ceased their offensive towards Lipsy, a village in Kharkiv Oblast the Russians were previously heavily pursuing. This probably had to do with the stiff Ukrainian defenses waiting for them in the area, reinforced by a few mechanized brigades, each about 2,000 strong, that arrived from the south. The Ukrainian forces also intensified counterattacks, managing to push their Russian counterparts back from several areas. By the end of June, there were no changes to the front line, and Ukraine managed to recapture many of the positions the Russian troops claimed in the initial push. July started just as forcefully, with the 3rd Assault Brigade claiming that it eliminated an entire battalion of Russian soldiers, killing 154 and wounding 301. The brigade also took credit for the destruction of a D-20 howitzer, 3 Russian-made Zala drones, and a tank. The fighting continued throughout July, and yet there were no recorded changes to the front line. On July 14th, the ISW reported a claim that the Russian Northern Grouping of Forces, the unit responsible for the summer offensive, didn't have enough troops for a fully fledged penetration of Ukrainian defenses to a depth of 25 miles. As you can see, the Russian tactic of pursuing multiple efforts simultaneously up and down the front didn't exactly pan out. Of course, Putin framed the embarrassing performance of his troops in Kharkiv Oblast as intentional, saying that Moscow isn't seeking any quick gains and that slow advances are all part of their strategy. As for the specific tactics used on the battlefield, they can best be described in one word: bizarre. Based on the accounts of the Ukrainian soldiers, the Russian troops would put soldiers on motorcycles and send them off toward the front line. The goal was to ride as fast as possible and avoid being hit. The ones who survived this suicide mission would ditch the bikes and move into trenches, fighting as infantry. This insane tactic had to be deployed for one reason: Russia has had issues with the lack of armor for its ground forces. Another solution for this issue came in the form of the so-called turtle tanks. Turtle tanks are makeshift armored vehicles, often cobbled together from available resources to compensate for the shortage of the more advanced and heavily protected tanks. These vehicles resemble a moving barn, and their goal is to absorb fire in an effort to clear a path for other units. With these risky tactics in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that Russia lost quite a few military personnel and much equipment in this summer offensive. But before discussing the reasons why this offensive failed so spectacularly and resulted in excessive loss of people and weapons, let's focus on the one that set the stage for the failure in Kharkiv Oblast: poor preparation. As mentioned, the idea for the Russian summer offensive was born out of the opportunity to exploit the destabilization of the Ukrainian forces due to a lack of military aid. As months dragged on, only two scenarios emerged for Ukraine. One, it would not be receiving US military aid again, as the political climate shifted and the support for Ukraine within the country waned. Or two, the delivery of aid would eventually resume, but it would take some time before the first weapons arrived in Ukraine. Although the Kremlin was convinced that scenario number one was far more likely, the Russians still didn't want to take any chances. This meant that they only had a limited window of opportunity to strike before the arrival of resumed US security assistance. So the Russian armed forces rushed to carry out their theater-wide offensive. However, in doing so, they seemingly forgot a crucial aspect of military strategy: thorough preparation. Benjamin Franklin once said, "If you fail to plan, you're planning to fail." And that's precisely what Russia did. The hasty approach led to poorly coordinated efforts, a lack of clear objectives, and a failure to truly capitalize on the initial advantage they sought to exploit. According to Kaufman, the offensive was launched way too early. His exact words were, "It's now clear that the Russians launched the Kharkiv offensive about a month before it was planned. The idea was to take the Ukrainian forces by surprise, which was somewhat accomplished based on the initial Russian success. However, the offensive seemingly took the Russians by surprise too, as some of the units assigned to the operation, such as the 4th Army Corps, hadn't even finished training. So instead of Ukrainians peeling troops out of the Donbass to send them up north, which was one of the goals of the offensive, the Russians ended up reassigning troops from the east. The lack of proper preparation can also be seen in the fact that the summer offensive was supposed to be carried out with 100,000 soldiers. However, even well past the start of the offensive, the ISW estimated there were 70,000 soldiers at most, even placing the lower end of the estimate at 30,000. It's clear that the Kremlin didn't allow sufficient time to mobilize, train, and deploy the necessary forces, further exacerbating the Russian operational deficiencies. So instead of taking Kharkiv Oblast by storm, all that Putin's poorly prepared offensive managed to achieve was to produce catastrophically high casualty rates. How high are we talking? The highest in the entire conflict. According to the British Ministry of Defense, Russia was losing as many as 1,262 soldiers per day in May and 1,162 in June. Similar figures were seen in July and August, with Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrskyi explaining that the Russians were willing to suffer heavy losses for minor gains. But if we're being honest, this is nothing new in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Even if the summer offensive was carefully planned and executed, chances are there would still be high casualty rates due to Putin's fondness for the so-called meat grinder military tactic. This tactic essentially involves overwhelming the enemy with sheer numbers, sending wave after wave of troops into battle regardless of the heavy losses. In Kharkiv, Putin showed that even a lack of substantial troop numbers didn't prevent him from sacrificing Russian lives with similar tactics. The motorcycle riders we discussed earlier are a prime example of this brutal strategy, which highlights the costly nature of Russia's approach to warfare. As operator Starsky, a Ukrainian veteran and blogger, puts it, Russians use their soldiers as cannon fodder. This is further proven by sending soldiers to battle in embarrassingly small units once the meat grinder runs out of large quantities of meat. According to numerous Western analysts, that's precisely what prevented Russia from making any substantial gains, let alone a breakthrough in Ukraine's defensive lines in Kharkiv. Approximately 10 to 15 unmounted infantry troops would make probing attacks to test defenses. In worst-case scenarios, as few as 6 men would try to sneak across no man's land to gain a trench foothold. But regardless of the exact approach the Russian forces take, the result remains the same: a substantial loss of life. From there, their general approach is just to mobilize more troops once the initial waves have been depleted. That's why Russia has been mobilizing about 30,000 people per month since 2024 began. As a result of this horrifying approach, Russia lost over 70,000 troops in only 2 months, with the Kharkiv offensive significantly contributing to these figures. This astronomical figure, provided by British intelligence, includes both wounded and killed soldiers. With it, the total number of Russian troop losses in Ukraine from February 24, 2022 to July 31, 2024 amounts to an astronomical 578,120. Worst of all, as long as the summer offensive continues, Russia's casualty rates are likely to average above 1,000 per day. Now, there's a reason why the numbers of killed and injured soldiers are reported together. In general, the soldiers who have been gravely injured on the battlefield don't return to the fight, meaning they contribute to the general loss of combat effectiveness. However, when it comes to Russia, any rules of military engagement fly straight out of the window, not unlike many of Putin's adversaries. You see, the members of the Ukrainian army have reported numerous cases of injured Russian soldiers being sent back to the front lines despite suffering debilitating injuries. Of course, by going back, they've all but signed their death warrant, raising the number of Russian fatalities and further weakening their offensive. Unfortunately, these cases aren't even the most horrific stories coming from the Russian ranks. According to operator Starsky, there are many reported cases, and even more disturbingly, videos, of Russian forces committing suicide because they're left stranded by their own, abandoned in dire conditions with no medical support or hope of rescue. With how little the Kremlin cares about its soldiers, can anyone truly blame them for the lack of morale and dedication needed to pull off something as ambitious as the summer offensive? What further complicates their situation is the heavy equipment losses in Kharkiv. After all, a soldier without proper gear is a sitting duck doomed to face slaughter. For Russia, the trouble lies in the fact that it can't replace the destroyed equipment. Even though Putin has ramped up military production to unprecedented levels, the constraints on the Russian defense industrial base are more than evident. For now, Ukrainian forces seem to be most proud of destroying Russian tanks, which forces the country's troops to resort to their ridiculous turtle tanks and fighter jets like the Sukhoi Su-25, which have been launching the devastating guided aerial bombs used in the region. When it comes to destroying Russian equipment in the border areas, the Ukrainian forces have seemed to heavily focus on the country's air defense systems. While these actions have contributed to significant Russian losses during the offensive, they primarily reflect a strategic focus on crippling key components of Russia's military capability before a crucial event: the arrival of the F-16 Fighting Falcon fighter jets. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been pleading for these jets practically since the invasion started. Even after Western allies finally pledged a number of the F-16s to Ukraine, the delivery has been plagued by numerous delays, leaving the Ukrainian forces waiting and hoping for a decisive boost to their air capabilities. Even so, they work on creating the right conditions for when these aircraft finally came. And good news for Ukraine, on July 31st, the first batch officially arrived. For now, we don't know how many jets Ukraine received and where they all came from. All we know is that they are part of at least 79 units pledged by the Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium, and Norway, and that they have the potential to completely crush the Russian offensive. The same goes for the rest of the Western-supplied military aid. Following the 6-month-long legislative blockade of the $61 billion military aid package for Ukraine, the US rushed to deliver help to the country as soon as the package was approved in late April. Of course, such a huge amount of aid has to be transferred in stages, but the first installment already made all the difference in the Kharkiv Oblast. Thanks to the ammunition and armored vehicles received from the US, the Ukrainian forces were able to fight back more and more as the offensive progressed. So while aiming to take advantage of the lack of aid, the Kremlin only managed to get the military aid package passed and delivered sooner. However, this isn't even the most consequential outcome of Russia's summer offensive. Thanks to this offensive, Ukraine's Western allies finally allowed the country to do something it had pleaded for since the invasion started: strike targets on Russian soil. You see, prior to June 2024, the Ukrainian forces were only allowed to use Western-supplied weapons to defend their territories, including the occupied areas. This significantly limited their operational scope and the potential to disrupt the Russian war machine. Seeing all the initial chaos caused by the summer offensive, the US finally lifted the ban, with other major European allies like the UK and Germany following suit. However, it's important to note that the ban was only lifted partially. What does this mean? It means that Ukraine still can't use Western-supplied weapons to indiscriminately target Russia. It can only use these weapons to target border areas used to launch attacks on Ukraine during the Kharkiv offensive. Though not an ideal scenario, this permission has been sufficient to apply pressure to Russian supply lines and command posts, halting the summer offensive. Generally speaking, Ukraine starting to fight back has been one of the major reasons Russia's summer offensive failed. When the offensive was first announced, most military experts were rather pessimistic about Ukraine's fate due to the country's severe shortage of troops, shells, and pre-established defensive positions. But then Ukraine managed to adapt and overcome, as it always does. Each of these problems was gradually being addressed. The lack of shells was covered by the incoming Western aid. To address the lack of soldiers, Zelensky signed a bill lowering the mobilization age for combat duty from 27 to 25. Though the numbers of subsequently drafted soldiers are kept a secret, it's clear that the bill helped Ukraine generate more fighting power in Kharkiv and beyond almost instantly. Unsurprisingly, the Kremlin didn't account for this when preparing the summer offensive, just as it didn't account for the arrival of the aid or stiff Ukrainian resistance. Echoing the sentiment of the entire invasion, Russia's miscalculations cost the country any potential victory in Kharkiv and beyond. All things considered, it becomes obvious why the Kharkiv offensive has been a huge failure. Not only did the offensive fail to accomplish any of the supposed goals, but it also actually weakened Russia's position in Ukraine. The Russian forces practically squandered firepower, which might have made a difference in another portion of the 600-mile front line. That's not to mention that the offensive cost thousands of soldiers' lives after being forced to attack on foot while unprotected. But take heart. Despite the challenges, Ukraine has shown remarkable strength and determination in the face of Russia's aggression. While there have been signs of continued Russian activity in Kharkiv as of August 1st, these are more of a reflection of Russia's desperation than its strength. Ukraine has successfully averted the worst-case scenario, and this is no small feat. With each passing day, Ukraine's forces grow stronger and more unified, ready to face whatever comes next. The journey is far from over, but Ukraine is more than capable of turning these ongoing challenges into future victories. So what do you think? Which will be next? Will it happen in Kharkiv or another part of the front line? If you're going with Kharkiv, do you think Russia has any chance to recover in this region, or is the summer offensive officially a lost cause? No matter how the war in Ukraine ends, one thing is for sure: Putin will come out of it battered and broken. Reports from August 5, 2024 state the country has lost 579,490 troops in Ukraine since the beginning of its full-scale invasion. Tens of thousands of vehicles, weapons, and resources have also been sacrificed. Russia's economy has been damaged beyond repair, and most importantly, the carefully constructed image of a resurgent superpower has irrevocably shattered, exposing Russia as a shell of its former self. Given these catastrophic and enduring consequences, it's only natural to wonder, would Russia's President Vladimir Putin have pulled the trigger on that fateful February 24th had he known what was in store for his country? The simple answer is probably no. But these consequences are so deeply humiliating that they practically beg another question: what was Putin thinking in the first place? Again, the answer is simple: he thought he would win, and do so with ease at that. But how could he possibly have been so wrong? This time the answer isn't as straightforward. However, it does revolve around a single thing: unfounded trust. Trust in his institutions, trust in his generals, and trust in himself and his misguided ambitions. Those are the three big mistakes Putin made. He trusted all the wrong people. This is the story of how that misplaced trust led Putin to make one miscalculation after another, leaving Russia in ruins forever. Now, before you start feeling too bad for Putin and his blind trust, you should know that he's fully to blame for each and every mistake and miscalculation made in Ukraine. In other words, Putin himself set the stage for his own downfall. His strategic blunders were not mere accidents. They were the inevitable outcome of a deeply flawed approach to governance. To understand the underlying reasons for Putin's three primary mistakes in Ukraine, we must travel back in time, back to the earliest days of Putin's rise to power. Even before becoming president of Russia, Putin made one thing clear: he valued loyalty above all else. In the 1990s, he served as the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg under Anatoly Sobchak, his mentor and former professor. When Sobchak lost his re-election bid by a margin of 1.2% in 1996 to Putin's fellow deputy mayor Vladimir Yakovlev, Putin didn't accept a position in the new city administration. His decision to quit was fueled by one thing alone: his loyalty to Sobchak. Supposedly, when he turned down the gig in Yakovlev's office, he did so with his now infamous quote, "It's better to be hanged for loyalty than be rewarded for betrayal." Though praiseworthy on the surface, this unwavering commitment to loyalty set a precedent for his future leadership style, often valuing blind allegiance over competence and merit. So since the very moment he became president in 2000, Putin gradually started to amass power and ensure it stays unchallenged. First, he found a way to remain in power even after officially ceasing to be the president. After serving his second term from 2004 to 2008, Putin engineered a political environment where he could serve as prime minister while Dmitry Medvedev took on the presidency. However, Putin effectively maintained control behind the scenes. He used that control to do what he's always done: discreetly eliminate any institutions that might pose a challenge to his authority. He made sure the media was pro-Putin or off the air. He suppressed dissent and controlled the narrative. As years passed, it became abundantly clear autocratic rule was making a comeback. But this wasn't the only comeback in Russia. The arrival of 2012 saw Putin back in office. After all, the Russian constitution only said that one and the same person may not be elected president of the Russian Federation for more than 2 terms running. It didn't say anything about more than 2 non-consecutive terms. And so, thanks to Article 81, Section 3 of the Russian constitution and some underhanded political maneuvering, Putin returned to power. Well, at least officially. Unofficially, he never left. To make sure he could officially stay in power for years to come, he made, or influenced, a few constitutional reforms. First, the presidential term was increased from 4 to 6 years in 2008, allowing Putin to serve his 3rd term from 2012 to 2018. Then his previous terms were magically erased in 2020, allowing him to run once again for president in 2024, even after serving 2 sets of 2 consecutive terms. It was a mockery of democratic principles. But there's no room for democracy in Putin's regime, only a ruthless consolidation of power and a calculated disregard for the rule of law. Given the political environment Putin built, it shouldn't be surprising that he's had nothing but sycophants and yes-men around him. After all, he has a track record of treating anyone who disagrees with him as an enemy. And we all know the eventual fate of his enemies. They suffer mysterious heart attacks, they fall from windows, their airplane or helicopter crashes, or they're simply shot dead in broad daylight. As a result of this brutal method of silencing dissent, only those willing to flatter Putin and follow him without question can remain in his inner circle. Simply put, Putin has created his own little echo chamber and has never truly received a reality check. This is what reinforces his delusions and leads him to believe he's always right. And this is what's caused his servicemen to feed him inaccurate information that has eventually led to disastrous miscalculations in Ukraine. Just look at it this way. If your life is on the line, you'll tell the dictator what he wants to hear, not what he needs to hear. Worst of all, this approach doesn't involve carefully collecting intelligence and then weighing what to share and what to withhold. No, it involves playing a guessing game of what the dictator wants to hear. After all, if truth has proven time and again to hold little weight in Russia, why bother seeking it in the first place? Why waste time? Essentially, Putin's approach to governance has stripped his advisors of any incentive to put in the hours and actually come up with sound advice for him. Had his advisors done so in the months before February 24, 2022, the devastating war probably wouldn't still be raging in Ukraine. But Putin's first mistake isn't setting up a system where truth is irrelevant or even detrimental. It's what all autocrats do. His first mistake was trusting the advice from the very institutions he had corrupted and controlled. To be more specific, Putin's first major mistake was trusting Russia's Federal Security Service, or FSB for short. The FSB is Russia's primary security agency and the main successor to the Soviet Union's infamous KGB, in which Putin once proudly served as a lieutenant colonel. This agency, eager to please and protect its position within Putin's regime, fed him optimistic and overly favorable reports about the situation in Ukraine. The FSB had 2 primary tasks: to gauge the West's potential response to another invasion and determine how the Ukrainian population, military, and government would react to a Russian offensive. In both tasks, they failed spectacularly. As far as the West goes, their mistaken assumption was that it would remain divided and passive, fearing economic repercussions. To the FSB's credit, that's precisely what the West did every time Putin previously flexed his muscles. In Georgia, in Crimea, in Syria, the West's response was tepid at best. When he gathered an army of 70,000 or so to invade Georgia in 2008, all he received was a financial slap on the wrist. When he illegally annexed Crimea in 2014, the West's reaction was mainly focused on sanctions that barely scratched Russia's economy. Sure, the United Nations General Assembly also passed Resolution 58262, with 100 countries in favor of protecting Ukraine's territorial integrity, but that's about it. A matching resolution wasn't even adopted by the UN Security Council, as Russia has veto power there. And when he propped up the murderous regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, the West could only muster vague condemnations and half-hearted measures. Basically, no punishment of consequence came for Putin when he had Sergei Skripal, a former Russian military intelligence officer, poisoned in the UK, or when the Russian hackers intervened in the 2016 US presidential election. In fact, Putin was only getting bolder, while the response from the West was only getting weaker. Germany was even at one point considering starting fresh with Russia, to the point where Angela Merkel, who served as Chancellor of Germany from 2005 to 2021, publicly questioned some of the US sanctions. Of course, there was no tale of friendship and forgiveness behind this skepticism, just a need for Russian gas, which made up 55% of all gas consumed in Germany before the invasion of Ukraine. So the FSB and Putin saw the West as weak and fickle, driven by economic self-interest rather than principled resistance. As such, the Western countries would never seek punitive sanctions that could harm their own economies too. They believed the West wouldn't be able to agree on a simple point, whether Ukraine was worth the fight or not. And in the chaos of indecision and fragmentation, Russia could just swoop in and take Kyiv in a matter of days. But where the FSB operatives failed miserably was recognizing that the West was actually starting to harden its attitude towards Russia. After years of Putin flouting the rule of law boldly and almost proudly, the Western policymakers started coming to terms with a grim reality. Putin was never going to stop. So succumbing to Russia's blackmail and intimidation was slowly ceasing to be an option for the West. In other words, there was never any doubt about how the West would respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Western countries weren't debating whether or not to get involved. They were debating whether Putin was truly foolish enough to go through with such a brazen move. But when he did, he was met with a united Western front. Russia was slapped with unprecedented economic sanctions. Hundreds of Western businesses withdrew from Russia. Millions of the country's assets were frozen. Even new German Chancellor Olaf Scholz froze the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project and sought a new gas supplier elsewhere. Though it took a while, Western countries eventually started delivering financial, humanitarian, and military aid to Ukraine. As of February 29, 2024, the US, Germany, and the UK have donated the most as individual nations. The US donated $2.53 billion in humanitarian aid, $21.47 billion in financial aid, and $43.08 billion in military aid. And that was before the $61 billion aid package was passed in April 2024. As for Germany, it sent Ukraine more than $37.24 billion in financial aid, making available much more than just military equipment. And that's not to mention all the aid it indirectly secured for Ukraine by tirelessly campaigning for other Western allies to step up. Finally, the UK has donated $16.3 billion in financial aid, of which $9.91 billion is for military assistance. That's pretty far from leaving Ukraine to its own devices, isn't it? But let's be honest, even if Ukraine was left to fend for itself, its people and soldiers would have fought Russia to the bitter end. This brings us to the second fatally wrong assessment of the FSB. The agency believed that the Russian army would meet little to no resistance in Ukraine. Even worse, there were strong beliefs that the Russian soldiers would be welcomed as liberators, not invaders. With this in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that Putin expected to seize Kyiv in a matter of days. Again, these assumptions are somewhat founded on past experiences. After all, Russia annexed Crimea without spilling any blood. It didn't even send in 190,000 troops as it did for the Ukraine invasion, just about 6 helicopters and 3 Ilyushin Il-76 airlifters worth of the so-called Little Green Men, i.e. members of Russian Spetsnaz special forces units with no military insignia. But if the FSB had actually done its job, it would have realized that Ukraine in 2022 was not Crimea in 2014. We aren't talking about a peninsula filled with apathetic or pro-Russian sentiments. We're talking about an independent nation with its own identity, culture, and independence, no matter how hard Russia tried to deny these. Just because some Ukrainians shared Russia's antagonism toward the West didn't make them pro-Russian. The same goes for expressing nostalgia for the Soviet era. According to a poll conducted in April 2014 by the Kyiv International Institute for Sociology, as many as 70% of Ukrainians from the southeastern provinces targeted by Russia were against a unification with Russia. So no, Ukraine didn't welcome the Russian troops with open arms and flowers. It welcomed them with bullets, with fierce resistance, unwavering patriotism, and a determined fight for its sovereignty, a fight that the Russian invaders were utterly unprepared for. Besides misjudging the Ukrainian people and underestimating their resistance, the FSB also underestimated Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. If it was up to Zelensky's predecessors Petro Poroshenko and Viktor Yanukovych, Putin might have just been able to walk in and seize Kyiv. But Zelensky, who the FSB pegged as a weak link and saw as an actor, not a politician, proved to be anything but a pushover. While Zelensky might not be perfect, he certainly rose to the occasion. This democratically elected leader didn't flee the country as the FSB believed he would. Instead, he stayed in Kyiv, often sharing messages of defiance and unity, rallying the Ukrainian people and fortifying their resolve. "We are here, we are in Kyiv, we are defending Ukraine," was one of these messages, a sentiment that the FSB never saw coming. But remember, Putin was the one to set this catastrophic misjudgment in motion. He has made the FSB what it is today, a toxic echo chamber of incompetence. So he got exactly the FSB he deserved and the intelligence he deserved, flawed, delusional, and disastrously misleading. The same goes for the information he received from his high-ranking military officials. This brings us to Putin's second major mistake: trusting his generals, who were no less adept at feeding him false assurances and wishful thinking. From the military perspective, Putin was assured that the invasion of Ukraine would be a walk in the park. After all, that's how the potential war in Ukraine looked on paper. In one corner you had the mighty Russian military, believed to be the second strongest in the world, a vast force equipped with modern weaponry, overwhelming numbers, and a reputation for brute strength. In the other corner, there was Ukraine, a country with a significantly smaller and less well-equipped military, plagued by outdated technology and years of underfunding. Just a comparison of the numbers alone should show why Russia looked a clear winner on paper. In 2021, Ukraine spent $4.7 billion on defense. Russia, on the other hand, spent almost tenfold, $45.8 billion. Ukraine had about 196,000 active duty troops and 900,000 reservists. Russia also had 900,000 soldiers, but they were the active duty ones, while their reserves boasted a staggering 2 million people. When marching into Ukraine, Russia sent about 190,000 troops, almost as many as Ukraine had in total. The situation wasn't any different in the equipment department. Ukraine had 3,309 armored fighting vehicles. Russia had 15,857. Ukraine operated 132 aircraft, Russia with 1,391. Ukraine had no submarines, and Russia owned 49. But as the battle for Ukraine began, it became clear that Putin's generals made two blunders. They overestimated the Russian forces and underestimated the Ukrainian ones. For starters, Ukraine wasn't the only battle Russia was fighting or having a standoff with at the time. There were also the Baltic states, Finland, the US, and NATO in general. So it wasn't like the country could deploy all its available troops and equipment to Ukraine. In contrast, Ukraine's sole focus was Russia, so it came at it in full force. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians of all ages mobilized almost instantly, queuing for hours to join their local defense units. As it turned out, the army that Russia saw as weak and disorganized was actually a collection of heroes ready to defend their homeland with unprecedented unity. Fleeing or surrendering was never an option, and yet that's precisely what Putin was told the Ukrainian soldiers would do in a matter of days, if not hours. But the problem wasn't just that the Ukrainian military turned out to be much stronger than anticipated. It was also that the Russian military turned out to be a far cry from the supposed second strongest military in the world. Faced with unexpected resistance and plagued by internal issues, the Russian military lost at least half its professional army in the first 6 months of the war in Ukraine. These numbers included some of the most elite soldiers and officers, as well as advanced weaponry and equipment. It seems that years of relentless propaganda, extravagant military parades, and rosy forecasts from his generals misled Putin into believing his nation had a world-class military capable of engaging and prevailing in any continental conflict. The actual performance of the Russian military on the Ukrainian battlefield painted an entirely different picture. As the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken put it, the Kremlin often claimed it had the second strongest military in the world, and many believed it. Today, many see Russia's military as the second strongest in Ukraine. Again, to be fair, these realizations came later, even for the most seasoned Western intelligence officers. Although US intelligence correctly estimated that the invasion was going to happen, it initially underestimated the scale of the Ukrainian resistance and the Russian military's inefficiencies. Simply put, US intelligence also believed that Kyiv would collapse swiftly. But the US intelligence officers were mistaken, as was Putin and his collection of sycophants. But even if we take Putin's lapdogs out of the equation, chances are the Russian president would still repeat many of the same mistakes. Why? Because he would let himself be blinded by his misguided beliefs and unfounded ambition. And that was Putin's third major mistake, his overconfidence in his infallibility and his catastrophic overreach. But let's pump the brakes for a second. Putin hasn't gotten where he is by making purely reckless decisions and moves. Before the invasion of Ukraine, he was perceived as a calculating and shrewd strategist, adept at leveraging power and exploiting weaknesses. So what led him down such a disastrous path this time? The answer to this question is multifaceted. First of all, it appears that Putin truly believed that Ukraine was Russian territory, and Ukrainians and Russians were one people, forcefully separated by the fall of the Soviet Union. He saw the separation between Russia and Ukraine as a historical injustice, and he was hell-bent on correcting this injustice at all costs. Worst of all, he has seemingly stuck to his conviction, as even after almost 2 years of conflict, he argued that Russia held a historic claim to Ukraine in his February 2024 interview with the former Fox News host Tucker Carlson. He also believed in his heart of hearts that the West was the true architect of this supposed division. To justify his actions, Putin propagated the idea that NATO's alleged expansion into Eastern Europe was the catalyst for his aggressive stance, blaming the West for forcing his hand and exacerbating the situation. In his eyes, he had no other option but to invade Ukraine or launch a special military operation as he saw it. Otherwise, Ukraine would have applied for NATO membership, as encouraged by the US, and the rest of Russia's European neighbors were likely to follow suit. Since he saw NATO's expansion as an existential threat to Russia, he had to act to ensure the survival and security of the Russian state and people and prevent a strategic encirclement. Paradoxically, it's precisely Putin's actions that ended up pushing Finland and Sweden, traditionally neutral countries, to join NATO on April 4, 2023 and March 7, 2024 respectively. So in trying to secure Russia's sphere of influence, Putin's invasion of Ukraine only accelerated the very outcomes he sought to avoid. Of course, many Western commentators see pointing the finger at NATO expansion as nothing but an excuse for his atrocious actions. In reality, Putin was fueled by a desire to restore Russia's superpower status and secure his legacy. That's the relentless ambition that blinded him to the realities staring him right in the face. To achieve these goals, Putin was seemingly ready to fight the entire West, not just Ukraine. He wanted to be revered in history books as the man who succeeded in restoring Russia's grandeur, defying Western dominance, and rewriting the global order. As Professor Brian Taylor, a Russian politics expert, put it, Putin saw himself as a great historic Russian leader restoring Russian lands. Throw his overwhelming public support and lack of blowback into the mix, and it becomes clear why Putin was so audacious. He was intoxicated by the belief that he was on the verge of a historic triumph. And let's remember, Russian success in Ukraine seemed more than plausible to everyone, not just Putin, so he wasn't entirely off base. He also seemed to believe that the timing for the invasion was just right. Zelensky's approval rating might have soared after the Russian invasion, but in 2021 it hit a record low. Only 12% of Ukrainians strongly approved of Zelensky's actions, which led Putin to believe the Ukrainian elite would likely unite against their president. In the same year, the Biden administration decided to withdraw the US troops from Afghanistan, an event that severely impacted global perceptions of American resolve and stability. Germany and the UK also got new leaders, as Olaf Scholz succeeded Angela Merkel as Chancellor of Germany, and Liz Truss briefly replaced Boris Johnson as Prime Minister of the UK back in September 2022. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron was under a lot of pressure due to domestic issues and a highly contentious presidential election. In all this chaos, Putin saw his chance to strike and avoid facing a united Western front. But just like the FSB, he was wrong. Due to his isolation during the COVID-19 pandemic and his rumored illness, Putin wasn't able to verify most of his beliefs and the FSB's claims. He also failed to see how weak his military truly was. Before the pandemic, he would often oversee military exercises and visit various facilities. He would travel often, engaging directly with military leaders and receiving first-hand updates on operational readiness. But as the pandemic took hold, his mobility was restricted and his reliance on remote briefings and filtered reports grew. This isolation eroded his grasp on reality and convinced him that he was the savior that Russia had yearned for ever since the Soviet Union collapsed. With the rumors of his long-term and seemingly terminal illness, Putin might have wanted to secure his legacy before his time ran out. Based on all these misguided beliefs, he made his gravest mistake. He launched a terribly miscalculated war in Ukraine. All of Putin's three major mistakes created the perfect storm that managed to reshape the global order, but not in the way that Putin had anticipated. The very institutions, tactics, and beliefs that kept him in power for over 20 years were now his undoing. But what do you think? Which of Putin's mistakes was the gravest, and which misguided belief cost him the most? Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia had the world convinced that it had the second strongest military in the world, inferior only to the United States. But as the dust of the war settled, it became increasingly clear that the mighty bear was merely a paper tiger. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, said it the best in a speech in Finland. The Kremlin often claimed it had the second strongest military in the world, and many believed it. Today, many see Russia's military as the second strongest in Ukraine. A case study in failure, that's how Blinken labeled the Russians, and the country's equipment, technology, leadership, troops, strategy, tactics, and morale. Increasingly, these aspects of the Russian military Blinken singled out almost perfectly match the very reasons Russia's military is weaker than you think. The reasons we'll discuss in this video. But before diving into these critical factors, let's examine how the illusion of a mighty Russian military might be constructed. The explanation is simple. It's all about appearances. Many people view the Russian military as the successor to the Soviet war machine, a force of sheer numbers and unyielding might. Remember, the Soviet Union was the one to spend over 20% of its gross domestic product, GDP, during the Cold War era to keep up with the image of a military colossus that could crush any adversary through sheer attrition and brutal efficiency. But appearances can be deceiving, And as the vestige of the Soviet legacy, Russia inherited more than just the image. It also inherited the underlying weaknesses. The weakness has now been exposed for the world to see, as the brittle core of the Russian military previously masked by hollow bravado cracked and crumbled when put to the test in Ukraine. So let's inspect each of these cracks that have caused the facade of the Russian military to crumble under the weight of its own overestimation. The first crack is arguably the most obvious. The Russian military has simply lost too many troops in Ukraine, weakening the very fiber of its operational readiness. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has lost as many as 561,400 troops between February 24, 2022 and July 16, 2024. That's more than 500,000 soldiers in a little over 2 years. The last time such devastating losses were seen was during World War II, when nations mobilized on an unprecedented scale. But in June 2024, Russia's President Vladimir Putin said that almost 700,000 Russian troops were fighting in Ukraine. So how weak can the Russian military possibly be, even after all these heavy losses? Well, first of all, does anyone really believe Putin's claims anymore, after they've been proven wrong time and again? But for argument's sake, let's say those figures aren't grossly overestimated. This begs the question, where are all these troops coming from? Because the Russian military casualties are very much real, and the country's armed forces comprised roughly 900,000 troops and officers before the invasion, so something definitely doesn't add up. The element missing in this calculation is conscription. In August 2022, Putin signed a decree to increase the number of Russian troops by 137,000. In December 2023, he ordered another 170,000 fighters to be added. If Sergei Shoigu, the now sacked long-standing Minister of Defense, is to be believed, almost 490,000 contract soldiers and volunteers joined the army in 2023 alone. Though he presents these figures through a lens of heroism and dedication, they probably have more to do with the generous pay and benefits offered to attract recruits. Namely, it's been reported that the Russian contract troops are paid at least 210,000 rubles per month, approximately $2,300, to fight Putin's war. That's over 3 times more than the average Russian salary, which was 71,419 rubles in July 2023. So it's possible that Russia does have the numbers when it comes to troops. But as you'll soon learn, numbers are all the country has. You see, many of the Russian military's most elite personnel perished in the opening weeks of the full-scale conflict in Ukraine. The new conscripts can in no way replace the expertise and battle-hardened experience of those troops, especially not when they're only conscripted for a year, most of which they spend in training. However, the more troops died in Ukraine, the shorter this training period and the more desperate Russian mobilization efforts became. The Institute for the Study of War, or ISW for short, reported that Russia even tried to draft new troops inside Ukraine by conducting a door-to-door mobilization effect in Kadivka and forcing residents of Luhansk into joining the military through extortion and threats. And that's on top of the 100,000 dangerous prison inmates Russia freed to fight in Ukraine and the many ill-prepared draftees in Putin's partial mobilization of 300,000 reservists. Drafting these reservists was such a huge mistake that even Putin admitted to it during a video call with his advisors, expressing his regret for drafting individuals with chronic illnesses, people too old to fight, and fathers with children. But this regret will do little to mitigate the severe consequences of such hasty and flawed mobilization efforts and appease the growing discontent within Russian troops, especially as it's becoming more evident that Russia still treats its troops as the Soviet Union treated the T-34 tank during World War II, as expendable assets. The T-34 was cheap to build, which allowed the Red Army to mass-produce them and send them to be destroyed. Similarly, Russia continues to send its soldiers into harm's way without any regard for their safety, seeing them as nothing more than pawns. In both cases, it seems that the prevailing sentiment was and is, hey, we can always get some more. As you can expect, this willingness to sacrifice Russian lives and conduct attrition warfare at a cost no Western country would ever accept hasn't really made the Russian troops fond of their service of their mission. This brings us to the second crack in the facade of the Russian military: the exceedingly low morale, fueled by a sense of expendability, the outright horrific treatment by the government, and the grim realities of war. In August 2023, a small group of Russian soldiers stationed in the Kherson region recorded a video in which they described their morale as being below floor level. According to the independent media organization translating war materials into English, War Translated, which shared and obviously translated the video, these soldiers complained about being sent to the first line of defense without proper training, air support, artillery support, and without heavy equipment. This video is on par with the November 2022 assessment by the ISW, which indicated that the morale and psychological state of Russian forces in the Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts were exceedingly low. due to high losses on the battlefield, troop desertion, and inadequate preparation for battle. All things considered, it shouldn't be surprising that the abuse of methamphetamines and other drugs is on the rise among the Russian military, according to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, a US government-funded media organization. The horrible treatment that caused such catastrophic consequences is also part of the third crack in the Russian military's perceived strength: the sheer lack of battlefield tactics and strategic foresight. So far, the only tactic the Russian forces have heavily relied on was the infamous meat grinder strategy. This strategy is exactly what it sounds like. Ill-prepared and ill-equipped troops are sent in en masse into combat in an effort to overwhelm the Ukrainian front lines. There's no regard for casualties or strategic objectives. The sheer unfiltered aggression, akin to feeding soldiers directly into the relentless meat grinder of battle. At first glance, this approach can make the Russian army appear formidable in its unyielding push forward. But upon closer inspection, it becomes clear this army is virtually gaining no ground while suffering devastating losses. A similar approach can be seen across all the other theaters. It seems that Russia is hell-bent on completely obliterating Ukraine, but in reality, it's only eroding its own military strength. The heavy losses in the military equipment department only further prove this. These losses also represent another reason why Russia's military is much weaker than you think: the fourth crack. According to the July 16th report by the General Staff of Ukraine's Armed Forces, Russia has lost the following equipment since the invasion began: 8,227 tanks, 15,862 armored fighting vehicles, 20,680 vehicles and fuel tanks, 15,368 artillery systems, 1,119 multiple launch rocket systems, 892 air defense systems, 361 airplanes, 326 helicopters, 12,193 drones, 28 ships and boats, and 1 submarine. Those are heavy losses for the military that was supposed to crush Kyiv in a few days, as was initially planned. Russia might have started the war with an overwhelming number of weapons and equipment, but most of these were soon proven to be far inferior to their Western-made counterparts. Take the Kamov Ka-52 attack helicopter, nicknamed the Alligator, as an example. Before the invasion, military experts considered the Ka-52 as one of the most capable aircraft of its kind. This twin-seat helicopter is an immensely upgraded form of the original Kamov Ka-50 Black Shark aircraft, which used a single-seat cockpit. Thanks to the upgrades, the Ka-52 is billed as a platform able to take on various roles, including assault, close air support, convoy protection, and armed patrols. All of this while retaining a maximum speed of nearly 190 miles per hour, a cruising speed of nearly 160 miles per hour, a ferry range of almost 700 miles, a combat radius of 285 miles, and an operational service ceiling of 18,000 feet. And yet the supposedly inferior Ukrainian forces have managed to down over 80 of these $16 million worth combat helicopters, which is reportedly half of the Russian total Ka-52 fleet. It is a case study in failure. The almost effortless destruction of the Ka-52 helicopters made the retired US Army General Ben Hodges question the competence of the entire Russian military, including the equipment and the personnel in charge of it. After a Ka-52 was shot down in the Zaporizhia region by the 47th Separate Mechanized Brigade and the incident captured on video, Hodges stated that the Russian pilot clearly lacked the skills to fly his attack helicopter. But incompetence in the Russian military doesn't stop there. It goes all the way to the top, to the military leadership itself, which makes for the fifth crack in Russia's perceived military might: chaos, dysfunction, corruption. Call it what you will, any of those words best capture the state of Russian military leadership today. Although truthfully, this has always been the case with the Russian top brass, but the invasion of Ukraine showed just how rotten the core of the Russian military hierarchy truly is. The event that single-handedly proved this was the firing of Sergei Shoigu, who held the position of Russian defense minister for 12 years. Though this move was anticipated for some time, it was still shocking given how close Shoigu was to Putin. So why did Putin decide to boot his longtime confidant? Well, there are a few possible reasons for this highly consequential decision, including the overall poor performance of the Russian military in Ukraine and his personal feud with Yevgeny Prigozhin, the late head of the Wagner Group, which culminated in the infamous June 2023 Wagner Rebellion. However, the primary reason why Shoigu had to go was his reported involvement in embezzlement schemes. As The Diplomat, an international online magazine covering politics in the Indo-Pacific region, puts it, the present-day weakness also shows what happens when you let one person, Sergei Shoigu, steal most of the defense budget. So if the one person whose job it is to ensure military readiness and capability only cares about lining his own pockets, how strong can that military truly be? The answer is painfully clear: not strong at all. Shoigu's departure isn't just a change in leadership, it's an indictment of a system riddled with corruption and incompetence, a system that has failed its soldiers and its nation. Another aspect that has failed the Russian military, leaving it vulnerable and exposed, is the state-run defense industry, aka the sixth reason why Russia's military is weaker than initially thought. This industry, once a symbol of Soviet power, has now become a relic of inefficiency and outdated technology. Plagued by mismanagement and corruption, it can no longer produce the advanced weaponry and equipment necessary to sustain a modern military force. Instead of innovation, there's stagnation. Instead of strength, there's vulnerability. This decrepit system has failed to keep pace with global advancements, leaving Russia's military exposed and underprepared for the challenges of contemporary warfare. Sure, Putin has recently ramped up the defense industry significantly, producing numerous artillery rounds, missiles, and drones, but the damage has already been done. The years of neglect and corruption can't be undone overnight. The new production may bolster numbers, but it can't mask the underlying weakness. However, even this so-called new production isn't always exactly new. What do we mean by that? Well, there's simply not enough time to produce new weapons at the rate Russia wants and, let's face it, needs. So the industry has resorted to dipping into its Soviet-era stocks and cannibalizing old equipment to keep up appearances. This is also the seventh and last crack in Russia's facade of strength, which has crumbled under scrutiny. In a way, the final reason why Russia's military is weaker than you think is the same as the first reason we mentioned. Sure, Russia might have exorbitant numbers of troops on paper, but these troops are poorly trained, inadequately equipped, and lacking in morale, a stark contrast to the elite units once boasted of by the Kremlin. Similarly, Russia might brag about high production figures, such as the reported 2,100 tanks manufactured in 2023, ranging from T-55 to T-62 to the latest T-90. But how many of these tanks have been taken out of storage, minimally refurbished, and sent to get destroyed on the battlefield? Quite a few, according to the Swedish Defense Research Agency. The same agency estimated that Russia produced only 520 new tanks in 2023, including 62 T-90M Proyevs, 62 T-90 T-90As, 80 T-80 BVMs, 140 T-72 B3s, and 140 T-72 B3Ms. So Russia might still have ungodly quantities of weapons and equipment, but these are subpar at best, bound to fail in modern combat. To make matters worse for Russia, these stocks can't last forever. In fact, they will only last to mid-2025, according to recent projections by a Ukrainian intelligence and analytical platform with a name that roughly translates to the military fortune teller. Naturally, the vehicles from these stocks, built during the Soviet Union's industrial heyday, can't be replaced with new production, which signifies more than just a logistical challenge. It represents a fundamental crisis in Russia's defense capability. For this reason, many experts believe that the Russian military is running out of time in Ukraine. The only thing it can do is turn to foreign imports from North Korea, Iran, and China, as it's already done during the invasion, eroding Russia's self-sufficiency and sovereignty in matters of national security. And a military that isn't self-sufficient is anything but strong. There you have it, the 7 aspects of Russian military power in Ukraine, where claims are one thing but reality is quite another. These 7 aspects reveal a military stretched thin, reliant on outdated equipment and foreign imports, plagued by corruption and incompetence, and struggling to maintain morale and readiness among its ranks. What if we told you that the current state of the Russian military was only partially to do with Ukraine? The truth is that the Russian military was always bound to fail, thanks to deep-seated weaknesses that long predate the invasion we've already mentioned. Coincidentally, these weaknesses also span 7 critical categories. So let's go through another list of reasons that made the Russian military weak in the first place. Many of them have directly caused the 7 cracks we discussed in this video. The first among them is the stubborn unwillingness to decentralize decision-making authority, symptomatic for over 5 centuries of Russian autocracy. As a result of the centralized decision-making, the Russian military has often been slow to adapt to changing circumstances and respond to dynamic threats and opportunities. It's also why Russia lacks an effective non-commissioned officer (NCO) corps, critical for effective battlefield management. Without a robust NCO corps, which serves as the backbone of many modern military forces, Russia struggles to delegate authority and responsibility effectively across its ranks, resulting in inefficiencies, poor coordination, and a lack of initiative among its personnel. But why does Russia cling to centralized decision-making if it does its military more harm than good? It's simple really, it's all the country has ever known. In Russia's long history, the power has always been concentrated in the hands of a single ruler, immune to external checks or popular control. This autocratic tradition has also shaped the country's military culture, which became focused on rigid adherence to orders rather than open communication and individual rights. In other words, the Russian military system has to be compatible with autocracy to avoid undermining it. That's why the Russian military has never properly trained NCOs to serve to mentor officers and teach the enlisted soldiers or empower them in any way. Since their role was virtually non-existent, the number of Russian NCOs throughout history has also been negligible. For instance, at the beginning of the 20th century, the Imperial Russian Army only had about 2 senior NCOs per company among its 12,000 long-service soldiers. For comparison's sake, the German companies of the same era had 12. So Russian companies couldn't execute any sophisticated maneuvers that required extensive coordination. It was all about sending soldiers forward en masse, regardless of how vulnerable they were. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Another deep-rooted weakness in the Russian military that's alive and well today is the lack of accurate information within the military ranks. Famously, Putin chose to storm Ukraine based on inaccurate intelligence, which guaranteed Kyiv would crumble in a matter of days. Unfortunately, we all know the horrific consequences of this miscalculation. Again, the inability to foster honest communication within the military and the government stems from a deeply entrenched autocratic tradition where centralized control is paramount to maintaining political power. The Kremlin relies on propaganda and coercion to suppress dissent and ensure conformity, perpetuating a culture where truthful communication is discouraged and dissenting voices are silenced or punished. Such an environment can only stifle accurate intelligence gathering and analysis, exemplified by the flawed intelligence that influenced Russia's decision to invade Ukraine. In addition, this historical precedent of conforming intelligence to fit Kremlin narratives has reached virtually every aspect of the war in Ukraine, perpetuating a cycle where information is manipulated or suppressed to maintain the ruling regime's perception of reality. That's probably why Putin and his lapdogs still believe Russia is the second strongest military in the world. It's also why these same people managed to severely underestimate Ukrainian resistance and Western resolve, which ultimately all but destroyed the country's military. Unsurprisingly, this is another part of its military heritage, the third we'll discuss: Russia's imperialist ideology. The imperial lens through which information is filtered in Russia perpetuates a culture of conformity and misinformation, shaping policies that underestimate opponents and overestimate Russia's capabilities. Throw selective historical interpretations and dismissal of alternative narratives into the mix, and it becomes clear how Putin has been living in his own little bubble for so long. It also becomes clear why he sent his troops into Ukraine, believing that there will be no opposition waiting for them. After all, Ukraine is Russian, and Ukrainians are Russians, right? Not even close. But what is undoubtedly Russian is the reliance on brutality to maintain control. The fourth deep-seated reason the Russian military is weaker than you think. The brutality ingrained in Russian military culture stems from a history of autocratic control and state violence, spanning from Tsarist institutions like Ivan IV's Oprichnina to Soviet-era organizations like the Cheka and KGB. Between 1971 and 1991 alone, an estimated 61 million people died in the Soviet Union as a direct result of state murders, mass deportations, and the Gulag system. This legacy has perpetuated a system where political dissent is suppressed through terror and violence, reflected in the harsh treatment of both civilians and soldiers. This pattern continued through conflicts like the Afghan and Chechen wars, where coercive tactics targeted populations to enforce government control, often with devastating humanitarian consequences. In Afghanistan, this approach resulted in 1.5 million civilians killed and another 6 million banished from the country. Corruption and neglect within the Russian military exacerbate these issues, leaving soldiers poorly equipped and subjected to systematic abuse, such as dedovshchina, a form of brutal hazing tolerated by officers to maintain discipline. The resulting impact on morale and unit cohesion undermines combat effectiveness, as soldiers lack trust in leadership. Again, quite a familiar scenario. This environment not only brutalizes Russian soldiers but also fosters a culture of disregard for international norms, evident in war crimes committed against Ukrainian civilians. After all, if they themselves were brutalized, why not take it out on someone even weaker? A terrible mindset, but one very much evident from the Russian military's conduct. Another factor that's contributed to this pitiful state of the Russian troops is corruption. Now, we've already mentioned corruption when discussing ineffective military leadership, but this factor is so endemic to the Russian military that it warrants specific attention. Corruption in Russia has deep historical roots, stemming from Tsarist autocracy through Soviet communism and into the present era under Putin. This pervasive corruption permeates all levels of society, including the military, severely impacting combat readiness and morale. Russian soldiers have historically suffered from embezzlement of salaries, inadequate equipment due to theft and black market sales, and logistical failures worsened by corrupt practices. Even during conflicts like the First Chechen War and operations in the Balkans, corruption plagued military operations, with soldiers selling weapons and supplies to enemies or for personal profit. Today, despite reforms and increased oversight, corruption remains endemic, affecting over 80% of defense construction contracts and compromising combat effectiveness. That's why Russia is ranked 141st out of 180 countries on the Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, down 4 spots since 2022 despite the supposed reforms. For comparison's sake, the US ranks 24th on the list, which is the same spot it held in 2022. A list where Russia undoubtedly ranks better is the list of countries by nominal GDP, where it ranks among the top 15 in the world. However, it was only when Putin fired Shoigu and replaced him with Andrei Belyusov, an economist, that Russia truly placed its economy on a war footing. Previously, the Russian economy was seriously neglected for years, which is the 6th underlying reason for the weakening of the Russian military. After all, a robust economy has always been necessary to sustain any military effort. All Russia did historically was heavily rely on fluctuating oil and gas revenues, which hindered diversification into other sectors and left the economy vulnerable to global energy market shifts. Of course, there's also rampant corruption, bureaucratic inefficiencies, lack of reforms, and insufficient investment in education and healthcare, all collectively weakening Russia's economy and, in turn, Russia's military. The 7th and final underlying reason for how truly weak the Russian military has become is the inherent difficulties in its plan to conquer Ukraine. Even if none of the previously mentioned reasons had been a factor, a swift invasion would have still been nearly impossible to pull off. After all, we're talking about some 190,000 troops and tens of thousands of vehicles navigating an urban area in the dead of winter with almost no air support due to the bad weather and lighting conditions. It was simply too challenging to quickly storm Kyiv, the 7th most populous city in Europe, with 3.5 million residents occupying 324 square miles, before Ukraine and its allies got the chance to react effectively. Of course, as we now know, this reaction was also one of the triggers of the downfall of the Russian military, which is practically fighting itself at this point. However, even with all these weaknesses, military experts aren't quick to write off the Russian military for a few reasons. 1. Russia has demonstrated an outright shocking ability to adapt and innovate in response to challenges. 2. Russia's weaknesses are far from the only factor necessary for Ukraine to prevail. And 3. A weak Russia is still very much dangerous globally, perhaps even more, as a wounded animal is known to be unpredictable and violent. But what do you think? Is this the beginning of the end for the Russian military, or is it merely a temporary setback? And if Ukraine is to capitalize on all these weaknesses, how should it go about it? The Soviet Union's notorious economic blunders led to its collapse, yet Russia seems to have learned little. President Vladimir Putin's recent decisions show that economic mismanagement is still rampant, threatening to doom the country once again. This time, these mistakes might also drag down the Russian army. Putin's war economy aims to sustain military operations, but a fully militarized economy can only go so far before collapsing under its own weight. Ignoring practical realities and the well-being of the forces only accelerates the downfall. Poor decisions are fracturing the structure meant to project power, jeopardizing military effectiveness and national stability. In this video, we explore how these economic missteps are undermining Russia's military and the nation's future. And this is precisely what happens in Russia, and precisely what this video will look into. But before we get to the unraveling, let's trace the path of Putin's economic missteps and the misguided decisions setting the stage for this looming collapse. Though Putin has never been particularly wise in his economic strategies, his ruthless invasion of Ukraine is undoubtedly what triggered the beginning of the end for the Russian army. You see, when Putin first launched the invasion against Ukraine, he expected Kyiv to crumble in a matter of days, securing a swift and decisive victory. Instead, he was met with unyielding resistance both on and off the battlefield. The resistance off the battlefield, the formidable response from the international community, was what tanked the Russian economy faster than Putin expected Kyiv to fall. Immediately after the invasion, the economic activity in Russia contracted by 4.4%. In a matter of days, the Russian currency, the ruble, lost over 40% of its external value. After that, it was one thing after another. Western companies soon started pulling out from Russia left and right. The country's assets were frozen. Its energy exports were targeted, and ultimately the Russian economy was isolated from the global financial systems. The sweeping international sanctions that made all this possible had a single goal: to weaken Russia's ability to wage war against Ukraine, and at first, it seemed that they would be successful. After all, there was no doubt about it, Russia's economy was on the brink of collapse. But in an unexpected twist, these sanctions, described as crippling, debilitating, and unprecedented by Western commentators, didn't bring about Russia's anticipated downfall. Instead, the Russian economy displayed a surprising resilience in 2023, allowing Putin to continue his aggressive stance. Quite expectedly, the Russian authorities bragged about the economy's 3.6% growth loudly and publicly, praising themselves for avoiding a deep recession in 2022. Much of this growth can be attributed to a single factor: the expansion of the military-industrial complex. It's probably after seeing that the military was the one to save the Russian economy from a more severe downturn that Putin decided to make it the foundation of the country's economic strategy. On paper, this decision seems to be a successful one, as the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, forecast a 3.2% growth for the Russian economy in 2024. This prediction, made in April 2024, was even higher than the organization's January estimate, which saw Russia's gross domestic product, or GDP, rising to 2.6%. What was perhaps even more shocking than the optimistic growth forecast was that Russia was expected to pass some of the strongest economies in the West in terms of GDP growth. According to the IMF, the US is expecting a growth rate of 2.7%, France 0.7%, the UK 0.5%, and Germany 0.2% for the same year, 2024. But let's remember one thing: Russia has always looked better on paper than it performed in reality. As history shows, superficial economic metrics like these frequently obscure deeper vulnerabilities that can lead to sudden and severe destabilization. That's why many experts warn that the talk of Russia's miraculous economic resilience is severely misguided. As Mark Sobel, the US chair of the official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum, puts it, Russia is masking a process of significant economic degradation that will continue well into the future and further marginalize its global footprint. But in a surprise to no one, Putin is doubling down on his economic strategies, driven by the belief that further militarization is the key to maintaining power and influence. With this in mind, let's take a closer look at the war economy and its main pillars, exploring how it's setting the stage for the Russian army's collapse. A single principle lies at the core of Putin's war economy. When public money is allocated wisely, it delivers results. Putin seems to believe that the wise allocation in question is massive military expenditures, while the desired result is saving the country's economy rather than bankrupting it. Of course, this principle is nothing new. This economic model has been shaped by decades of Soviet-era fallacies and delusional beliefs. This model is only new in the sense that Putin has never used it before the invasion of Ukraine. You see, when Putin assumed power in Russia, it was in the wake of the 1990s liberal reforms. In his early years in office, he even appeared to advocate for significant restructuring and liberalization of the Russian economy. Today, you can only find the faintest traces of liberalism in who Putin chooses to keep in charge of various aspects of the Russian finances. Now, Anton Siluanov, the Minister of Finance, Elvira Nabiullina, the Governor of the Bank of Russia, and Maxim Oreshkin, Putin's economic advisor, are in no way liberal. However, they can be described as rational technocrats who prioritize stability. So why does Putin keep them around? Well, Putin might be a lot of things, but he isn't stupid. He knows the importance of maintaining strong macroeconomic indicators and economic stability to preserve his grip on power. He was well taught by several liberal economists at the beginning of his rule, including Alexei Kudrin and Anatoly Kubayis. But the question is, how long will Putin be able or willing to sustain this precarious balance? As things stand, it seems that he's gradually moving away from any balance and diving headfirst into a risk-laden economic strategy. This shouldn't be surprising, given how strongly the people around Putin believe in Russia's so-called special military operation in Ukraine. This misguided cult-like belief single-handedly fueled the conviction that exorbitant government spending on the military-industrial complex could not only sustain the war effort, but also sustain and even grow Russia's economy. So how exorbitant are we talking? So exorbitant that it almost reached the scale of the Soviet-era military spending during the Cold War. Of course, we're referring to the total amount of money being spent and not the share of GDP used for what Russia shamelessly calls defense and security purposes. After all, it's well known that the Soviet Union spent upwards of 20% of its GDP on defense while trying to portray itself as the boogeyman to the West. Today, only Ukraine exceeds this percentage, allocating as much as 37% of its GDP to its defense amidst the ongoing conflict. As for Russia, the country is committing roughly 7% of its GDP to defense, amounting to around $140 billion. For comparison's sake, Russia was spending only $65.91 billion on defense in 2021 before the invasion, which was around 3.72% of its GDP at the time. Even when the invasion first started in 2022, the military spending couldn't come close to what it is today. In 2022, Russia's military budget was $86.37 billion, or 4.06% of its GDP. However, it's important to note that a huge portion of Russia's federal budget, almost a quarter of it, is still kept secret. Given everything we know about Putin's plans, it's safe to assume that the actual war-related spending in Russia's federal budget is even higher, significantly higher. It goes without saying that such an absurd scale of military spending is only feasible under an autocratic regime, a regime willing to prioritize guns over butter to achieve its end goal, which in this case is Russia's special mission. If you aren't familiar with the guns versus butter model, here's a brief explanation. The guns are the government's investments in military capabilities. The butter is civilian needs and welfare. So the guns versus butter argument simply refers to the trade-offs between these two competing priorities. Under this model, an autocratic regime like Russia's can skew heavily toward guns and neglect butter almost completely. After all, it's not like it will face any public scrutiny or opposition. To Putin's credit, he hasn't entirely given up on the butter, at least not publicly. What he did was instruct his economists to find a balance between guns and butter. His exact words were, "While increasing our defense and security expenditures, we bear in mind that all our social obligations to the people must be fulfilled and that our national development goal must be achieved in all spheres, including in social protection." He further explained that he primarily referred to education, healthcare, and support for veterans. Of course, Russia's federal budget lacks the necessary money for all this butter, so this part will have to be handled by the market sector, which continues to function in Putin's Russia thanks to the foundation laid by the reforms of Russia's former Prime Minister, Yegor Gaidar, over 3 decades ago. So we have a market economy, the dominant emphasis on the military-industrial complex, and state interventionism. This fascinating mix has prompted many analysts to conclude that Russia is on the path of adopting an economic policy resembling military Keynesianism. If you aren't familiar with the term, military Keynesianism is an economic theory that advocates for increased government spending as a means to stimulate economic growth and employment. The equation is simple. Invest in the military sector heavily and you'll get more economic activity, jobs, and technological advancements. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? For a prime example of military Keynesianism, all you need to do is look at Nazi Germany or the US during the Cold War. In Nazi Germany, extensive military spending was used to prepare for a potential war with Slavic nations. Under Adolf Hitler's regime, military spending reached approximately 40% of Germany's GDP by 1940, compared to 8% in 1935. This surge in defense spending was instrumental in reviving the German economy, reducing unemployment from over 34% in 1933 to under 2% by 1939. Similarly, during the Cold War, the US invested heavily in defense and technological advancements, so by the 1960s, defense spending reached close to 10% of the country's GDP. Even then, there were numerous questions about how sustainable military Keynesianism truly is. Some experts believe that spending a lot of money on military production, which is essentially a form of high-tech production, leads to the development of the technological sector as a whole. The result, the subsequent innovations benefit the civilian economy. Others, however, strongly believe that advances in military technology have almost nothing to do with the civilian sector. Essentially, they claim that the military-industrial complex robs the civilian economy of vital resources, including workers, which in no way can help the overall economy. By now, it's quite clear which side Putin is on. The one that believes, or tries to desperately cling to, the notion that military spending serves as a driver of development. This was made abundantly clear by the shakeups in Putin's cabinet, which have shocked the world. By this, we primarily refer to the dismissal of Sergei Shoigu as Russia's defense minister. Now, don't get us wrong, this move was by no means shocking from a strategic standpoint. Shoigu's departure was the culmination of mounting criticisms and failures during the war in Ukraine, so there was nothing surprising about it. The shocking part is that Shoigu has been one of Putin's closest allies for decades, a trusted confidant who had weathered many storms alongside him. This had led some to believe he would be safe from such upheaval. Well, as it turns out, no one's safe when a dictator's country is unraveling after getting badly beaten by a supposedly inferior foe. In such dire straits, even the closest allies become liabilities, and the once unshakable pillars of power are ruthlessly dismantled in the scramble to salvage a crumbling regime. But who is Shoigu, and more importantly, who was he replaced with? Sergei Shoigu, a seasoned figure in Russian politics, served as the Minister of Defense from 2012 to 2024. His tenure was marked by extensive military reforms and a significant buildup of Russia's armed forces. So it's no wonder Putin entrusted him with the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, ordering him to capture Kyiv in a matter of days. To be fair, this order was inherently impossible to achieve, as it underestimated both the resilience of the Ukrainian forces and the complexities of urban warfare. Can you really expect some 190,000 troops and tens of thousands of vehicles to effortlessly storm an area of 324 square miles with 3.5 million residents in the dead of winter? Though a resounding no is the obvious answer, Putin was never the one to accept the obvious. So he failed, and Shoigu failed. However, Shoigu's failure to secure a swift victory in Kyiv wasn't the only issue at hand. As the war dragged on and Russian losses mounted, Shoigu's position became increasingly untenable. That was what eventually led to his dismissal in May of 2024, while it was at least partially responsible. You see, Shoigu's failures, as well as the Russian government's crackdown on corruption among the high-ranking defense officials, weren't the only reason why he was removed as defense minister. The move actually had more to do with who the new defense minister is, rather than the missteps of the former one. If you need proof, all you need to know is that Shoigu wasn't banished from the government altogether. Instead, he was appointed the Secretary of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, which is quite a high-profile, and dare we say lucrative, position. So who's the new defense minister that warrants all this intrigue? The answer is Andrei Belousov, an economic technocrat. Before he assumed office as the defense minister, Belousov served as the first deputy prime minister from 2020 to 24, an aide to the president in economic affairs from 2013 to 20, and minister of economic development from 2012 to 13. As you can see, there's no mention of any military-related positions in his extensive resume. That's because Belousov has no military experience whatsoever. From this fact alone, it's easy to conclude that Putin is no longer viewing the Russo-Ukrainian war as a battle of military might alone. Now the war has become a battle of resources. In other words, Putin finally realized he couldn't achieve a lightning victory, and it only took him 2.5 years to come to that realization, and that he must brace for the long game. Of course, the mere notion of Putin preparing his country for long-term warfare terrifies both Ukraine and the remainder of Europe. This move only confirms what many in Europe have feared for months: Putin won't stop at Ukraine. But many people fail to understand one thing. It's not so much that Putin wants to continue fighting, as much as he can't afford to stop. What do we mean by that? As Renaud Foucault, a senior lecturer at the Department of Economics at Lancaster University Management School, explains, the war in Ukraine has become the main driver of Russia's economic growth. However, this war is also responsible for decimating Russia's economy in other crucial ways. So if Russia were to stop fighting, it would have to deal with the economic reality of a nation burdened by sanctions, a diminished workforce, and a deteriorating infrastructure. This might lead to social unrest and a potential collapse of the fragile stability that Putin's regime desperately clings to. Paradoxically, even winning in Ukraine could spell trouble for Russia. How so? The country simply doesn't have the means to rebuild the occupied areas that would come under its control, nor to maintain security in them. So for Russia, the only viable course of action is to keep fighting, in Ukraine, in the Baltic, in the entirety of Europe. That's why Putin needs an economist as the defense minister, as only an economist can navigate the treacherous waters of sustaining a war-driven economy. Putin himself stated that only an economist can make the country's military budget, which has now reached gargantuan proportions, efficient. With Putin's comment to the long war in mind, you can probably start to see why this new economic model spells doom for the Russian army. So let's finally dive into it. You've probably noticed that the focus of Putin's new economy has solely been on the military-industrial complex so far. In other words, the focus is on the weapons and equipment. But what about the people handling those weapons? The soldiers, the officers, the very backbone of any military force. How are they faring under this economic shift? In short, not great. And that might be the understatement of the century. Only about 30% of the entire military budget is spent on the army itself. The rest is allocated to weapons procurement and production. And not even the whole 30% is dedicated to military salaries. Approximately 20% of the budget goes to pay. At the same time, vast sums are siphoned off through corruption and inefficiency, a problem that Belousov is ostensibly trying to address. Of course, trying is the key word here, as Russia's Minister of Defense still seems to act as merely an intermediary between the state budget and the military industry. The industry is the one that holds virtually all the power. This particularly applies to one man, Sergei Chemezov. Chemezov, an oligarch and the CEO of Rostec Corporation, a state-owned defense conglomerate, seemingly has more influence over Putin than Belousov. Putin confirmed this by appointing Denis Manturov, former Minister of Industry and Trade, the first deputy prime minister after Belousov's promotion. Manturov is Chemezov's close confidant, which means that his promotion allows Chemezov to continue heavily profiting from the surge in military spending. And while Chemysov and his ilk make absurd amounts of money, it's the common soldier that suffers. From the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022 to July 19, 2024, 564,620 Russian troops have been casualties in Ukraine. That's according to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces. That's almost 0.4% of the entire Russian population. The last time Russia experienced such extensive casualties was during World War II, when approximately 8.7 million military personnel died over 6 years of intense conflict. It's worth remembering that World War II is the deadliest military conflict in history, involving over 100 million people from more than 30 countries. The war in Ukraine, on the other hand, has only been waged between two countries for a little over 28 months. The sheer fact that it's produced such staggering losses highlights the unprecedented ferocity and scale of the ongoing conflict. These shocking figures underscore another thing: the utmost disregard for the lives of Russian soldiers. Putin seems to be hell-bent on pursuing his strategic goals at any cost, even if it means sacrificing the very troops meant to achieve his ambitions. That's why the most common tactic employed by the Russian army is the so-called meat grinder strategy, which involves overwhelming enemy positions with massive waves of infantry. Prioritizing sheer numbers over strategic precision, this approach has only resulted in one thing: horrific casualties. As far as Putin is concerned, he can always just get more soldiers. After all, the boost in the economy allows him to hire contract soldiers who flock to the Russian army for the $2,300 monthly paycheck. If all else fails, he can just carry out another wave of forced conscriptions, compelling more Russians to join the ranks and fill the gaps left by the staggering losses. He did so in August 2022 with 137,000 people, and in December 2023 with another 170,000. This relentless churn of personnel underscores a grim reality. For Putin, human lives are expendable, and as long as his economy can sustain this horrifying soldier turnaround, that's all they'll ever be: mere cogs in this brutal war machine. But what about Belousov? What's his role in all of this? Well, as soon as he was appointed defense minister, he stated that equipping the Russian armed forces would be his first priority. As he put it, everything that is effective in the country should be put to work to achieve victory. Now, to be fair, equipping the Russian army isn't a futile endeavor, as many of the troops have complained about being sent into battle without adequate gear and support. Yet Belousov's focus on this aspect reveals a critical flaw. He's aiming to enhance a system that already devalues human life, rather than addressing the underlying issues that perpetuate the catastrophic loss of soldiers. The grim reality is that improving equipment without reforming the underlying strategy and leadership will only make the meat grinder more efficient and more deadly. The Russian army's morale is already at a record low, so no amount of improved gear will prevent the continuing spiral into chaos and despair, especially when the improvements in question are coming from someone who is a complete outsider to the Russian army. Remember, Belousov isn't a military man. He's a laboratory academic who hasn't even served in the military as a conscript. In fact, he's probably never even held a gun. So how can he expect to inspire confidence or make meaningful changes when he lacks the most basic understanding of military life and combat needs? Belousov's background in economics and academia, while valuable in its own right, simply doesn't translate into an intuitive grasp of the realities faced by soldiers on the front lines. However, it's also worth remembering that Shoigu has also never been in the military, which didn't prevent him from sporting a general's uniform decked out in medals. But despite his lack of personal combat experience, Shoigu embraced the military traditions and an image crafted to exude authority and command respect. He seemed like he wanted to run the Russian army himself. And as you already know, playing pretend goes a long way in Russia, a country where appearances and titles often overshadow substance. So while trying to get the black hole of military spending under control, Belousov is likely to only weaken the Russian army, eroding what's left of its effectiveness and morale. Of course, there's also the question of the long-term future of the Russian army. Even though Russia is undoubtedly preparing for a long fight, Benjamin Hilgenstock of the Kiev School of Economics believes that the war must end at some point. When this happens, the military spending will come down again. But what will happen to the army veterans? Will Russia have the funds to reward them and glorify them as it used to do almost religiously? Not likely. As a result, the veterans might find themselves abandoned, left to face the harsh reality of what Russia truly is. And with the widespread disillusionment, both among those who fought and the general public, comes the shattering of Russia's military legacy once and for all. So what was once believed to be the second strongest army in the world will inevitably crash and burn. And all of this because one man decided to play real-life Risk. Do you agree? Is the Russian army done for, or can it still recover from this catastrophic gamble?